In this chapter, we're going to talk about the Maroczy structure, or from White's perspective, it's even called the Maroczy bind, because, well, sometimes White can really control the black position. Structurally, perhaps it looks very similar to the headshots we debated in the previous chapter, but it's actually very, very different. In the headshot, we saw black having pawns on e6, d6, a6, and b6, which basically covered all the relevant squares in the white position, so white could not really approach the black position. The Maroczy structure is very, very different. The Maroczy structure is more solid. You can say that this pawn on d6 is well protected by a pawn on e7, and that actually makes a major difference. If we look at this black position from a structural point of view, there's actually no weaknesses, which is a considerable difference from the headshot structures. Perhaps I'm overselling the black concept, but that's because this was a huge childhood love of me. I played this Maroczy bind from the black perspective for at least 10 to 15 years, and I was very inspired by my chess idol Bent Larsen, who was one of the great practitioners of this sort of setup for black. The huge difference to the headshots is also that, well, I said black has this solidity, and it becomes quite more simplistic in terms of plans. The book author describes quite some black plans. He says maybe you can play a6 and b5. Sometimes you can play e6 and sometimes you can play f5. But actually, from my perspective, I see it quite differently. That black, well, he doesn't need that many plans. He's rather staying solid. This knight on b8 will jump to c6, and he will have a knight on f6, and he will have a very strong bishop on g7. And somehow there's also going to be a bishop on c8, and there is natural places for all the black pieces. You don't need to make any kind of breaks. Actually, sort of the pieces flow quite naturally from here. And it's more about being solid. Quite often we would play the move a5, which in the headshot structure would be quite bad. We would weaken the b5 square, right? But in the Maroczy, actually, white will get access to the d5 and the b5 squares. But we will just think that's not too important, that maybe we will be happy to have our knight on c5 and say, well, we have this strong square on c5 in return. So it's a much more positional and much more slow kind of structure compared to the headshot, I would say. Of course, we will see a lot of things happening, and in general, nowadays, when I played it, it was considered slightly dubious but quite playable for black. These days, with modern computers, I guess the estimate of black chances has fallen a little bit, but we would get into that into the chapter. But sort of from a general perspective, it's a much more solid structure for black. If we look at it from the white side, well, I mean, it's obvious. We have this nice space advantage, and all things being kind of equal, space do matter in chess. And while I said black was capable of maneuvering quite freely within his sort of confined space, of course, part of the problem for black is that white can move very freely within his sort of space. He will have typically a knight on d4 on c3, and the bishop then can go to e3 and to e2, and he can basically develop his position very, very sort of fluently in a way. And well, it's turned out that this space advantage can be used to white advantage. A revelating thing for me was that I had a game against Gulko. I will go into it a little bit in details in one of the examples. But on a sort of more systemic level, what Gulko told me was that quite often it makes sense for white to retreat the knight from d4 to c2. And it is weird in the sense that you're removing a strong knight backwards. The knight is in general better placed on d4. But this gives white, sort of black, the possibility of actually making an exchange. And with the exchange, black somehow position gets less confined. So keeping more pieces on the board could be a problem. And this was actually kind of the reason I started playing this system with black less, because it started to feel too cramped when white kept all the minor pieces on the board. So well, it's basically me talking about youthful love, but also later realizing that perhaps this was not as good a system as I really thought in my youth. But we will get into this in the chapter. Hope you will find it interesting. We are starting off this Maroczy chapter with a classic. It's Pulagievsky against Ivkov from 1969. And it's, well, as I said, it's a classic illustration of white's advantage even in the endgame. Well, if we look at this position, both players has developed their pieces quite normally. I mean, black's position generally looks harmonious. The queen is getting out to a5. He would like to play rook f to c8 next to have sort of good coordination. But Pulagievsky plays a typical move here. He plays the move knight to d5. It's basically a double threat, right? It threatens to take the pawn on e7 with check, but it also threatens to take the queen on a5. Now, Ivkov takes on d2, which is extremely logical, but based on this game and, well, similar games, it's nowadays considered a mistake. Actually, knight d5 is not considered a good move here anymore, because it turns out that it's possible to take the pawn on a2, and then after taking on e7, king h8, it seems like black has sufficient counterplay here. Well, the book mentions bishop e2, then the funny move knight to g8, basically getting rid of the knight on e7, but at the same time opening counterplay towards b2 with the bishop. And, well, here black is okay, but, well, our theme is not a theoretical debate, it's sort of improving our understanding. So for that purpose, queen takes d2 is very relevant. White takes back with the king, and now, well, we can see there is this immediate threat of taking on e7, but also it is somewhat inconvenient just to cover the pawn. You can't go rook fe8, because then, well, knight c7 is going to be a fork on the two rooks. The book mentions it's not hopeless playing a move like rook ae8. There is no sort of immediate way to punish it. Probably white should develop with bishop d3 or rook c2 and have a quite comfortable position. I mean, black's position is quite clumsy, right? For instance, these rooks are awkwardly placed, but it's no particular disaster. But Ivkov quite logically wants to take on d5. The natural piece to take on d5 with would probably be the knight, well, keeping the pair of bishops. The problem is that after the recapture, there is an immediate crisis in terms of a rook entering the c7 square. Well, bishop d7 you would like if you were capable of playing rook c8 and sort of countering in the c-file. But you can't do it immediately, of course, because then rook c7 happens and, well, we have a problem. So black would have to play after cd5 to go bishop to c8. But this is a kind of very sad situation. Sure, there is this immediate threat, but, well, the book mentions just b3, and we are gonna eventually put a rook on c7, probably bishop d3, connect the rooks. It's just a very, very unpleasant ending for black. So the specifics here is not really in black's favor. What Ivkov is doing, and what has been quite typical, is that, well, he gives up the pair of bishops. White now takes back with the c-pawn in order to try and enter in the c-file, and then black quite naturally opposes like this. Well, this is, well, it was even at that point a theoretical relevant position, but I think the conclusion now is just that white is considerably better. Pulagievsky just develops naturally bishop e2. There's nothing particularly wrong with that, but sort of the evolution in this position was that the most exact way of doing it was to take on c8 instead, and then follow up with g3. Now we're going to put a bishop on h3, and we will start challenging the c-file already. This is actually already quite awkward. Problematic is also that there is going to be a threat on a7. Not immediately. I mean, if we took on a7 here, well, that would make very little sense, because then black gets rook a8, he gets to play rook takes a2, and there's actually counterplay and he gets to activate his position. But potentially, of course, it's a threat. We can see that if we go bishop to h3, he then follows up with the rook to c7 to keep the c-file, then we can actually snatch the pawn on a7. So after g3, there is some kind of immediate crisis, and it's very hard to do anything about. Let's say a6. The book actually comes with a bold statement here. He says, this is losing because of bishop h3, rook c7, and now this instructive move, rook to c1. And, well, the point is simply that after takes, these are actually deadly weaknesses. There's no reasonable defense to sort of white attacking them with bishop c8. Well, you can play b5, I guess, but I would assume that sort of eventually we're gonna attack these pawns and you're gonna lose them, well, at least minimum one of them with a lost position to follow. So this is actually quite a critical situation. Probably the best is knight to d7, a typical move. It starts perhaps also attacking here, but the book mentions, well, bishop h3, well, pinning like this. You have to go rook c7. Now we're gonna take, and well, taking perhaps looks weird, but there's a concrete reason for it. We would like to play the move rook to c1, but right now the b2 pawn is hanging. So we will play the move b3. And now, well, this is an actual threat, taking the pawn on a7. And when sort of black has to defend that, we can go rook c1, and we're just gonna have the c-file for free. I cannot prove this is a one position for white. It's not particularly relevant, but it's a very, very promising and a completely risk-free position for white. So this, well, you see the dynamics here, that after g3, the black position is actually very, very unpleasant for some concrete reasons. And it's a mixture of space, of pair of bishops, but we also see that there is immediate tactical threats towards the h7 pawn, and quite often we will give up the pair of bishops and we will take the c-file. And, well, black cannot play like this anymore, and this line fell out of fashion. But anyway, we were here to see how Polugajewski did it. He played the move bishop to e2. Nothing wrong with that. As mentioned, these pawns are a little bit of a problem, well, especially the pawn on a7. And how to deal with it is not very obvious. Of course, playing the move b6 has some positional sense. And you could argue that, well, if black was in time to play knight d7, a5, knight c5, things are not too bad. But we move in turns, and after b6, basically it's game over after bishop to a6, because now there is a threat here, and basically the c-file, well, I think let's point it like this. White will take over the c-file, and there's nothing you can do simply, and while losing the c-file is just a strategic disaster. I think, well, let's say something like this. You could try to go knight d7, combining the threat of taking on b2 with knight to c5, but a position like here, b4, is just completely winning for white. There's nothing you can do from the rook entering to c7. It will attack weak pawns like this, and maybe you can reshuffle the bishop to c6. The rook on a8 will have to move away, and a7 is falling. It's basically a trivial automatic win. So here, it's not so easy after bishop e2. Ivkov played probably the best move, a6. And now things are slowing a little bit down. White has to, well, figure out what to do next. We saw that if the bishop was on h3, you could start swapping in the c-file and try to exploit these weaknesses. But with the bishop on e2, white has to do a somewhat slower concept. But he does it quite nicely, Polugajewski. He plays the move b4. I guess at times we would consider playing b5 and opening files on the queen side, but he has a slightly, well, he has a quite different concept in mind, as we will see. It's also, well, I mentioned space on the king side, queen side, and that's going to be very relevant later. But it's important to also point that well, you cannot play a move like b5 because there's going to be the potential undermining move a4. And, well, here, immediately, you can actually just swap like this, he mentions in the book. And, well, if this happens, well, you either go a4 immediately or you will put the king to b3 and play a4. And basically, well, you're going to end up with a potentially deadly weakness on a6. Well, you had that weakness already, but with a4, we will actually make it a relevant and probably fatal weakness. So this position is just close to winning for white. So after b4, Ivkov, well, quite cleverly, just bring his king sort of towards the center to try and help out. I mean, his sort of argument is that, sure, white is pleasantly better, but it's not going to be enough to win. But that's probably a wrong assessment. Pologievsky just grabs more space, plays a4, knight d7, and another nice move, a5. It's basically, it's fixing these weaknesses, and, well, we're not going to get to them immediately, but we are making sure that they will stay there forever. Let's say in a position like this, black starts insinuating he wants to play a5, and that will sort of lead to winning control of the c5 square, but well, for his knight. But now after a5, basically these pawns are stuck, and also the c5 square is not going to be a relevant square for the knight because we have a pawn on b4 that is not possible to undermine. So Ivkov, well, tried to force an exchange in the c file. Pologievsky plays rook to c2, something like takes, bishop back to g7, king b3, and rook to c8. You can argue Ivkov has done moderately well, right? He's keeping control of the c file, and should white go rook to c1, then probably black is solid enough here. He will run the king to d8, and he will probably make a draw. But Pologievsky quite cleverly chooses not to exchange rooks now. I mean, we saw earlier examples where the rook exchange was quite deadly for black. But here, I think it plays into black's hands. And, well, this is indeed just a purely defensive move, sort of connecting with the c3 square. But while you can say it's passive, I think also you can say that, well, this is just one piece that basically suppresses black's counterplay. Well, black is hoping for the c file, the c3 square in particular, and this knight is going to towards c5. But just this bishop and this pawn basically keeps this whole counterplay in check. So there is basically nothing black can do here. I think the question is, what can white do? Well, Ivkov puts his bishop on a reasonable square. The next move for white is praised quite in the book, but it's actually a mistake. It's a little bit of a random mistake, but a mistake it is. White is quite better here, and why is that? I guess, well, we can always point to a pair of bishops. It's typically nice, but I think it's mainly connected with the space advantage and weaknesses here. And while this is sort of centered on the queen side, actually what white does to break through is to start pushing on the king side now. Maybe that sounds a little bit illogical, but, well, I guess the argument is you're opening a second front, you want to create more weaknesses, and basically, at the moment, black is sufficiently solid with his pieces to keep the queen side under control. So you need to pose other problems. They might be solvable locally on the king side, but that will mean that he will have to drag some of his attention to the king side, and then we're going to break through on the queen side eventually. Pologievsky plays the move g4, which is quite logical. Well, you're basically, you want to grab space, and then, well, that will kind of lead to problems on the king side that, as I mentioned, black will have to attend to, which will then weaken his queen side. But g4 is actually quite weirdly a tactical mistake. Well, the computer suggests moves like rook d1, perhaps playing g3 followed by f4, so on and so forth. But well, he plays g4, and I've never seen this criticized before. But the computer says that actually it's a considerable structural mistake because black can play the move g5. It's just a tactical trick that if this, you actually get quite serious counterplay towards the king, and this is not really what white wants. I mean, well, you can only go to a4, and then I guess rook to c2 starts harassing like this, and black seems to be fine. So after g5, suddenly, well, black actually gets quite some control of the dark squares. And, well, the dark squares are very important for him. I mean, well, that's where he still has his bishop, and the knight perhaps can start jumping to e5 now. And, well, yeah, also the f4 square. I will guess that, well, when you have a structure like this, it is quite inconvenient if black starts blocking you on the dark squares. And that became possible for tactical reasons now. And, well, if you had the pawn still on g2, you could play g3 and f4, and it would not be a particularly problem. But this exact structure is actually quite ugly for white. But anyway, Ivkov didn't take his chance, and that's perhaps also quite typical. I mean, on the previous move, or generally for the quite last moves, Ivkov had to resign himself for just defending passively, not trying to blunder anything. And looking for tactical resources is probably not what you do, but you really should, because else, well, you are doomed for this passive defense we will see here. King g7 is a considerable mistake, not only in terms of not spotting g5, but also by allowing the move g5. Now, the computer already says that white is close to winning. And I guess this is quite interesting, that simply moving a pawn from d2 to g5 considerably increases sort of white's winning potential. But, well, I think I tried to explain it somewhat in detail, that white needs to, well, create some targets, create some good things happening for him on the king side, simply to force black to attend to that, and then the queen side is going to break at some point. So rook c7 happens, rook d1, king f8, f4, bishop to g7. This is going for just a passive defense. The book is debating, perhaps you could argue, let's play e6 instead and do something active. I think it's one of these typical examples where when you have a bad position and you have choice between active and passive defense, you will choose one of them, and the commentators will say maybe you should have tried the other one. And it's quite reasonable, but also, let's say he actually had defended actively and lost, we would have said maybe you should try passive defense instead. So I think it's just a sad position. Well, the book mentions you can take an e6, and after bishop c4, attacking the e6 pawn, right? King e7 is a logical move. And then we start doing h4. And with h5, we are probably going to, let's say, open the h file. The rook can start attacking towards h7. It's a very, very sad position for black. Sure, you can play like this, but to say that it's better than in the game, I think, no, that's not really the case. It's just a very difficult position for black. So bishop g7 he did, and bishop went to g4. A very useful square. I mean, well, we saw it in the opening phase when bishop e2 was criticized for not going g3 and putting the bishop on h3. There is this potential of reaching these pawns eventually when we have changed a set of rooks. Perhaps not directly, because the king can actually go here and support the knight, but it sort of gives away that the g4 square is quite useful, because it is, if not threatening directly, at least insinuating the possibility of landing on a square where these weak pawns will drop. And, well, if these pawns drops, it's game's over. So black puts his king to e8, and Pulagievsky does the move rook f1. It's perhaps slightly puzzling to me. I mean, you don't want to play f5 probably, because then the knight will jump to the e5 square. But also, it's a position of no particularly hurry whatsoever from white's perspective, so you can more or less do what you want. Bishop goes to d4, just flipping back and forth. And now, I think a nice next stage of the white attack. He starts pushing the h-pawn. So something like this. And, well, yeah, we will never really know why he played the move rook f1, but now at least he puts it on h1. And then it starts becoming very unpleasant in terms of you always have to consider what happens after takes rook to h7. Right now, with a bishop on d4 sort of protecting the f8 square and a knight being able to go to f8 to attack the rook on h7, it's not an immediate problem, but the tension is there. And, well, black will have to constantly pay attention to this possibility. He goes bishop g7, rook to h3, and now brings the king a little bit closer, sort of that it, well, I would say that it tried to work in two directions defensively. It's ready to go and help if need be. The next move I really like for white. To attribute it to AlphaZero is way too strong. Also, we're talking about 1969. But it's still a cool move, and I would say a modern move. He plays the move h6. It's just a great technical understanding. Generally, at least for me, before the AlphaZero sort of things happens, and we started to realize the sort of very strong power of the pawn on h6, it felt wrong to me. I mean, well, why use so much time putting the pawn here, having the rook in the h-file, not to actually exploit the open h-file, but to close it instead? But it is a very significant amount of, I don't know if space is the right word, having the pawn on h6, but it cramps black, and also there is this potential weakness of a pawn on h7. It starts sounding weird that in this position, well, what are the weak black's pawns? I would say h7 and b7, well, to some extent a6. And you could argue, but aren't they completely protected? And also not only protected by itself, but also protected in terms of that, well, white actually have pawns blocking them. And there is some truth in that. But there is also truth in that should h7 drop or should b7 drop, it's not a minor problem for black. It's complete disaster. So you are fixing some very, I don't know, heavy weaknesses is the right word. I don't know if I had the right word in English, but it's something that is really potentially deadly. And I think that is sort of the key understanding, that while, yes, we could get the h-file and we could do something with it, we should not underestimate the power of such a weak pawn on h7. And when this pawn drops, well, then this one is going to queen. So we are really talking about some, well, game-deciding sort of weaknesses should they start to matter. And h6 is a very cool move. So he goes bishop d4, and now he gets slightly criticized by our author here, because white could actually win with a move like just bishop to c3. And, well, the logical argument, well, can't black just exchange everything like this? And he can, but white is just winning in this position. Basically, well, we start to soon to realize the power of the pawn on h6. The threat is to go e6 and start undermining the black position. And there's no particularly reasonable defense against that. Let's say king c7 is the logical move. Then we go e6. There is, well, of course, a threat of taking here, but also here, so he has to exchange. And now after bishop takes e6, knight f8, just something like f5. And there's nothing reasonable you can do. I guess, well, the book mentions take like this, and if king d8, there's gonna be bishop takes h7 and just g6, and these two is just gonna pawn quite sorry, not pawn, queen quite trivially. And well, yeah, this is the power of the pawn of h6 that. Well, these endings will win quite trivially. We will see a perhaps better example in the game. But no, the author has a point. Bishop c3 is a more clean win in the way that Pologievsky wins, but it really doesn't matter. So rook d3 happens. I guess Pologievsky's point was that after bishop h8, he didn't want to calculate bishop c3 to make sure the pawn in there was winning. He just wanted to go e5 here now. And, well, the point is that after d5, now you have this nice move, rook to c3. The rook is sort of unprotected, so it forces this exchange. And now, well, this is a threat. So you have to go king e8. And in this position, well, you just exchange and play fe5. And this is very, very trivially winning. It's gonna be easily decided by zugzwang. This bishop is not just bad, it's dead. And by dead, I mean that it doesn't have any kind of legal square where it cannot be taken immediately. Sometimes, at least if you could be able to go back and forth, you could play for a fortress. But now, with the bishop not being able to move, we will win incredibly simple by zugzwang. I mean, after this, I think both d6 would be winning. Something like this, I would assume, is very trivial, and we open like this. And, well, we're gonna get access to the c5 square. If he plays b5, let's say something like this. Again, it could look like a fortress, but after I move like, oh, sorry, I should try not to blunder my pawn on e5. So let me go, let's say bishop b2, king to b6, bishop c3, king to c6, bishop to d4. I'm covering the b6 square, and your king has to go backwards when I get to play king c5, and game over. This is basically what I mean, that this bishop is so dead that trivial zugzwang is gonna decide. So that was Pologievski's point. Well, he tried bishop to a7 instead, and now he plays bishop h3, bishop g1, bishop to c3. He wants to sort of push for e5, it seems. King goes to e8, e5, and, well, bishop h2 happens. Now he takes on d6, takes back, gives a check, king d8, rook to e4. Again, the author says that you could win immediately like this, but Pologievski, he wants to win in a more, you could call it clean or simplistic way. He doesn't want to allow any kind of counterplay. Or you could either say that he doesn't want to calculate any kind of forced line that it involves minor complications. You could argue this is laziness, but you could also argue it's just a good technique. If you can win without any kind of complications, why not do it? And basically, he just protects the pawn on f4, and after he moves the bishop to g1, now he takes on d7. And the point is that, well, whatever you take with, if you, let's say you take with the king, then it's bishop f6, and you cannot prevent rook e7 check. Or if you take with the rook, then we're going to give a check, and after king to c7, now we're going to go rook to e8, and we will do like this, and we're going to actually win the pawn on h7, and when we've done that, our pawn is going to queen. And this is, well, exactly the point of the move h6, that, well, this becomes this deadly weakness we spoke about. If the pawn had been, let's say, on h4 or h3, sure, white would win a pawn, but then the counterplay against f4 would be relevant. But with the pawn on h6, winning h7 is game over because the pawn queens. This became probably maybe almost like too long a video describing this endgame, but I think it is relevant to understand that exchanging queens like this can quite often be a considerable mistake, because the endings arising from this structure, it's always going to depend on specifics. But here the specifics very much favors white. If black could play, let's say, rook fc8 and king f8, protecting the e7 pawn, maybe black would be fine. But here we saw that, well, black is kind of forced into either doing something very passive like rook a8 with his clumsy rooks, or he's forced to open the c-file, and we saw this kind of problems it created. I think perhaps take stage d3 is also very relevant to sort of grasp how important it is that here after bishop h3 and the weakness of these pawns, we are actually speaking of a close to winning advantage, while what we saw was also extremely unpleasant, but of course less forcing and direct, where it becomes more difficult to prove if it's a win or a draw. But anyway, I guess we got to see that, well, even something like this, how unattractive the black position is and how easy it is for white. It's basically, well, we would call it a free roll. I mean, white gets to try to play for a win without any kind of risk whatsoever. So big warning signs from black's perspective of not doing this. And also, it's important to understand that this is kind of an ideal for white we would really like to achieve. Our next example is the same position, but 44 years has passed. We are in the Netherlands, and it's Smits against Tiviakov from the Dutch Championship. In the previous game, we saw Pulegievsky play the move knight to d5, and being very successful in the ensuing ending. But we also mentioned that knight d5 actually is not a particularly good move, because queen takes a2 works for black. And this is how you see, I would say, evolution in chess, that we start to understand positions in a more refined manner, and we act accordingly. So Smits plays the move b3. And, well, now I think Tiviakov had a pretty bad day, because he's confusing the move order. He should have played rook f to c8 immediately, and it basically preempts the knight d5 move. It's a move you cannot prevent white from going knight d5, but you can make sure the circumstances he does it under is not particularly attractive. Now, black can exchange the queens, and then he can just take on d5 with the knight and play the move bishop d7. In general, allowing this exchange on d5, giving white just a pure space edge. Well, we saw in the previous example, it can go horribly wrong. But here the circumstances are pretty good for black. He's fully contesting the c file, so white doesn't have it under control. And it's basically based on this typical and small tactic that you can't take on a7 now because of rook a8. And, well, basically there is counterplay like this. And, well, here black is better, but of course white will not do it like that. But after the position after bishop d7 is solid enough for black. He doesn't have many weaknesses, and I guess after something like bishop to d3, there is not even a threat of rook takes c8 next, but you could probably also play something like a6, and because you have a bishop on d7, well, the b7 pawn is very, very hard to get at for white. So this would be fine for white. White would not play after rook fc8. Knight d5 is not really the move. The way white was doing it was playing the move bishop e2, and after a6, he would swap the queens via knight a4. And then position would be like this. There's a threat of knight b6. Black would have to play knight to d7, covering it. And most often, white would play the move g4 and try to sort of create space on the king's side. And sometimes black would counterattack with b5. And we have an interesting position here that is probably okay for black, but playable for white. But this was sort of the logical way for the game to develop after b3. Tiviakov played the move a6, which it's not an inaccuracy, it's just a mistake, because now, after knight d5, white is getting the best of both worlds. If you swap the queens now, well, then it's generally quite horrible. Maybe you should try rook a8, but was not attractive in our previous example, and this time it's just worse. There's also a weakness on the b6 square now. But in this position, well, also, you can't really start taking like this. I guess we will do c takes d5, and there's going to be this immediate threat of rook c7, and we saw that if let's say rook c8 here, well, this was very, very powerful to do like this and put the bishop on h3. So Tiviakov faced an immediate crisis, and he played the move queen to d8. So basically, he has just yo-yoed back and forth like this. You can argue it's not a full loss of two tempes, because white did spend one of them to play knight d5, but it's not a bad square for the knight here. So it's pretty tragic what happened to Tiviakov. Well, bishop b6, you can argue, is not such a typical move in the Maroczy, but it's typical because black would never really allow it. So, well, yeah, queen d7 happens, bishop to e2, and there is a swap on d5 like this. I think what the author wants us to see is that even with queens on the board and symmetry, it still can be quite an advantage for white. The game goes rook fc8, and white just castles. And I guess the problem for black here is that there is very little positive to do. Tiviakov tries to, I would say, normalize the position. Well, very often black would have let's say a queen on d8 and a knight on d7 with some kind of logical play, and he tries to get this position by playing queen e8. Smets goes back, bishop preempts, knight d7 happens, and well, we get a position like this. Black is solid, but he lacks counterplay, and while there is symmetry, it is very unpleasant symmetry. Smits goes g3. It's a nice move. I don't know, I would say grabbing space, but I guess we would like to put our king on g2. It feels a little bit more cozy there, I would say. It has more air around it. I think one of the very interesting discoveries of AlphaZero in a conceptual manner was that while humans typically wanted to have sort of, let's say, pawns on f2, g2, h2 in front of the king, the Leela or AlphaZero kings actually also wanted more breathing air around it. I think on g2, it's a great combination of having a solid structure in front of your king, but also having mobility that it can, the king itself can go in all kind of directions is necessary. And of course, also with white having space advantage, it leaves the option of pushing for a kingside attack with h4. So I think it's just a useful move playing g3. Tiviakov goes knight to c5, and well, we can see that he's trying to make a block on the queen side. Well, we see it after rook c2. He plays the move a5. At sight, this looks like a very solid construction, right? How is white gonna break this down? Well, we will see in this example, it breaks down very easily. But sometimes it's actually very solid. So it very much depends on circumstances. But here, well, because of the unfortunate queen maneuver, well, the queen actually went from d8 back to a5 and now to d7 and to e8. Black has lost considerable amount of time. So white can basically mechanically break down this fortress. Well, you can say it's a fortress, but it's a pregnable fortress. It's a fortress you can actually break through, right? So rook f to c1 happens, b6, and now a couple of very nice moves. He just plays queen to d1, and well, we'll see the idea. The next move is that after queen f8, there is the strong move a3. So basically, it's gonna be b4. And then this knight is going to be ejected, and well, weaknesses down the c file is just going to be decisive. It feels just like so easily flowing in a way for white. So he tries rook cb8. He understands the b file is gone, and after b4 takes, he decides that passive defense with knight d7 is basically too terrible. I think white will start with bishop to b5, attacking the knight. The queen goes back to d8, and then he goes queen to e2. The author says, sure, live with it, play rook a7, at least you're covering the entry square, and you're forcing white to actually break down your position. There's no doubt that this would be a better way of doing it than what happens in the game. This reminds me a little bit of how Gatakamsky is defending. He's known as a very stubborn defender, and I think one book describes it, I've forgotten which one, but it says that, well, his ability is not to make a bad position worse, and that is kind of an underestimated quality. It's forcing your opponent to play well, and that he actually has to break through. What typically happens is exactly what happens in this game. That, well, Tiviakov looks and says, okay, I mean, I really don't want to defend passively. It looks so tragic, which it is. Let me try something active instead. But by trying something active and faulty, he doesn't put the burden on winning, particularly on white. Basically, the black position collapses. He made it. He forces white to maybe find one or two good moves. While had he played the much more stubborn defense, here in a position like this, white actually has to play well to win. While what we're gonna see now with the knight on b3, it becomes very trivial. So white goes rook b1, attacks the knight here. Black's idea is that, well, he's hoping there is some kind of activity like this. I mean, after all, don't I have a strong knight and an active rook? And white's argument is, no, you don't. This is the threats are fictional, while my rook is very well placed there. It attacks your weak pawn. Basically, you're just dead lost. And, well, the game was, he tried knight a1, and Smith took on b6, and later he basically queened the b pawn, and that was it. I don't know, what did we sort of learn with this game? Well, I think we sort of, well, we saw the, evolution of things here. We saw that, well, b3 is what you do, and I think, well, rook fc8 is important to understand that here actually time is really of the essence. We need to take the sting out of this knight d5 move. But, well, from our perspective, it's good we got to see it, because we got to see a position like this where, despite, there's absolutely no immediate disaster in the c-file, we got to see that long term, this is quite unpleasant for black. That this position is nowhere, it's not like you can say, sure, I'm just going to exchange stuff in the c-file, and then you are going to have the pair of bishops, but it doesn't really matter. No, it matters, and we saw actually, again, well, building a little bit on the other side created some kind of difficulties. But of course, I think the main plot was, I would say, the understanding of maybe this position. That, well, if you see this as a visual image, how would I describe it? I was like, yeah, probably black is completely fine here. I mean, the position is solid. There's no obvious weaknesses, but the advanced understanding of the position is that black can be fine, but it really depends on, is this knight on c5 underminable or not? I mean, could it stand on c5 forever? Let's say, I mean, well, if white would play this absurd move b5, it's not legal, but then black's position would be completely fine. But because this knight is so unstable, it's gonna depend on tactics. And we saw here that, well, you can just go queen d8 and now a3, and you push the knight back, and the c-file becomes white's possession, with basically very tragic circumstances for black. So I think still we are getting to understand the sort of basic potential of white, and we are seeing that what can look solidly for black's perspective, if you lose the control of the c-file, when sort of this structure happens, it can actually be very, very difficult for black. Our next example is still in the category of unpleasant endings from black's perspective. We can see that white, there is still this spatial advantage, and there is the advantage of the c-file. And it's not trivial for black to counter this, but while the other examples was, well, generally bad, this one is sound, but black has to play well, which unfortunately black doesn't manage fully in the game. The game goes king to f8. It's logical to sort of bring the king here. It's as a plan we have seen before. But here, it's not really the right timing to do it like this. Of course, a very logical question would be, can black just counter in the c-file? The author actually doesn't mention that, but as far as I can see, he kind of can. I guess what sort of discourages the author is endings like this, and, well, rook c8, takes. Generally, I would say at first sight, it looks like white can just walk towards the center and perhaps towards the weak pawn on a4. It's actually this pawn on a4 that causes considerable amount of trouble. Was it on a5? It would be more solid. It would be more difficult for white to attack it. But here, basically, we can argue there is, well, at least in Danish, we use the term, there is a highway towards the weakness. But it seems like black can counter it. In this position after king g1, well, we should go f5, and if king f2, then the nice move f4. Well, sure, white can go in this direction towards b4, but this is countered by black trying to access the center. And well, should he go to the b4 square, we're gonna enter like this with more than sufficient counterplay. So it actually seems that black is okay. Even I would say in this position, I would say probably doing f5 first is the better move, because if rook c7, then we can do rook c8, and we have this counter threat of mate on c1, so it's impossible to take on d7 like this. f5 is also, well, it's quite a nice move. If white decides to take like this, then the pawn on d5 is gonna be weakened, and well, the computer says black is just completely fine here. So opposing in the c file would be okay for black, but not by passive means. You see, you have to undermine with f5, and you have to bring towards the king towards the center, and you're okay. But it's not such a simple position to play, perhaps. Another good move would be to play the move e6. It's a bit in the same category that, I mean, it looks a little bit ugly. Black would rather just draw with the pure solidity of his position. But as we will see, that gets him into trouble. But by acting now, he creates counterplay in time. I think, well, part of it is that now, well, you can take back with the bishop, you create a counter threat like this, and there's also the possibility of something like d5 next. And black is kind of exploiting that the white king is on h1. In other examples, it's been around the d2 square. And then, of course, it's much more central. And I think that is perhaps what tricks me and also Predojevic in this position, that it looks normal position. It looks like white should be better. But actually this king is very far away. It's, yeah, I think it's, well, 1, 2, 3, 4 squares away from d2 where we normally have it. And this kind of tilts our intuition a little bit. We see that, you know, the king can get to b4. Well, it can, but it takes so much time that black actually has his own ways of counterplay, be it undermining with e6 or f5, or even bringing the king towards the center. Predojevic does it, well, too soft. He goes king f8. Now white doubles, and kings go to e8. It's a very classical way of neutralizing white's counterplay, and perhaps had the pawn been back on a5, it would be okay. It's still not in sort of the area of losing, but it becomes more difficult to play. So king d1 happens, rook c8, king to f2, king to d8, king to e3. Things start to look good and nice for white, but the computer actually says no, black is okay here. And again, I think the problem is that the moves that feels natural, the moves that feels very Maroczy-like, leads to trouble. He's playing the move b6. Perhaps I think he would like to play the move rook c5 next and then keep things very much under control. But this basically leads to trouble. The correct move was to play e5. Well, maybe like this, or maybe, well, the author suggests maybe take on c3 first. Here the computer is actually toying with the idea to take back with the b pawn and then to go rook b1 next. Black is still okay, but there is still some kind of unpleasantness. So maybe black should play the move e5 here. And it considerably improves the center. And somehow, well, not taking en passant, well, it also leaves black the possibility of playing f5, but of course also it blocks the d4 square from white's perspective. The author analyzes with this inclusion, and he says something like this, you take back with the f pawn here, and after f4, rook a5, the black position is quite solid. It starts making quite some sense. I mean, this rook is perhaps defending on the 5th rank, maybe we want to play h6 and g5, and it seems to be quite okay, and it also seems considerably less passive than what we're gonna see else. So this is still within I think we can call it trivially drawing or comfortably drawing, maybe comfortably drawing. You still have to play quite well, but I think by playing the moves e5 and rook a5, you're already done most of the difficult work here. So it's possible to draw this kind of positions, but it seems easier for white to play in a way. Black becomes, too sort of schematic in a way. He just plays the logical move, but non-weakening moves that doesn't take any kind of action. So he plays b6, and now the next move is nice. He plays rook takes c8. Generally, when we have space advantage, we don't really want to exchange like this. But, as I mentioned, part of the idea is to sort of go towards the a4 pawn. And there actually not having rooks helps white. He should have taken back here with the bishop. Of course, a move like rook c6 looks unpleasant, but then after rook b8, let's say f4, you can kick the rook back, and after rook c1, rook a8, white is doing fine. It's a pleasant position, but I think having rooks on means that the white king becomes a less powerful piece. And, I understand there is some kind of illogic in that, but, the computer quite agrees that here black is holding fine. I guess we would have an active rook on a5, and let's say if the king goes here and starts pushing e5, at some point we will have e6, and we're going to create some counterplay. While without the rooks, as we will see, it becomes very, very difficult. So black takes back with the rook, and white is very happy to swap like this, and the game was f4 here. Now we are entering the area where it's borderline. Is white winning or not? Probably, I would say, this seems to be the last chance. It's kind of getting too late for playing e6. White will take, and I think this position is just lost. If you take with the pawn, then basically we can go king to d4. So let's say bishop to c6. It seems that we will just remove sort of the target here, and we're going to go e5 next. King c7, e5. I think this is a winning ending for white. I think I looked at d5, but after bishop d3, kind of eyeing these weaknesses. And the idea is that for something like bishop e8, g4, we are starting to insinuate doing f5, which, it's gonna undermine the d5 pawn or create a pass pawn on f6, obviously. And if there is mutual exchanges on the f5 square, it's going to lead to the h7 and d5 point being too weak. I tried to analyze it a bit, but I think the computer shows there is no reasonable way to defend. I mean, something like this, you're just going to go bishop to c2, eyeing this pawn. If you start playing b5 to defend it, then you're allowing my king to enter like this. And I think, for instance, king d8, I'm sure you could prepare things better, but you could also just play f5 now. And, if black takes twice, we're going to take on d5 like this, and basically this is a winning position. Now there is weaknesses here and there, and white is just going to win this. So e6 is not great here. Here actually, black can hang in by playing the move f6, and the idea is that we want to be able to meet g4 with g5. It's crucial to gain space on the king side, but rather not to leave this crippling pawn on g6 as we see in the game. Like this, the author also cannot find a win, and me neither, despite having modern computers. If h4, it's crucial to go h6, and he tries to, says that compared to the game, let's say g4, we have this crucial move g5, and after exchanges like this, it's a major difference that this pawn is not on a white square. So this kind of seems to hold, but of course it's very unpleasant. For instance, he mentions you can do king d4, and here playing for e5. It's not at all trivial. Maybe at some point there is a risk of, let's say, e6, and this bishop could end up being stuck on e8 with no squares to go. It's a very difficult position, but the computer says with perfect play, black is probably gonna make a draw. Sure, if you play correspondence chess, such things are fine. From a human perspective, I think we've seen the two previous examples. We see this one as well. They are just very difficult to defend for black, this kind of endings. Some of them are dead loss, some of them are possible to solve, but we can see that if we look at it from a more competitive perspective, it's difficult. The game was king c7, which is a serious mistake, because now, like we saw in the Pologievsky game, white will start gaining space, getting the pawn to g5. And, here, the main point is that it's gonna make a weakness on g6, sort of, the white space edge is gonna combine with this pawn being weak. So, f6, and now the crucial move g5. This is just a winning position. Black was kind of hoping that the exchanges would sort of be enough, but they are not. b5, king d4, king b6. I guess at first sight, it might look at, isn't black just completely solid here? But it is Zugzwang that's gonna bring him down. Sure, there is some kind of fortress, but it's broken quite easily. Black tries to, after bishop d3, to put the king on a5. It's insinuating playing king b4. But after a3, there is just nothing reasonable that can be done. He could try to, you can call it to be active, but it doesn't really threaten anything. White wins trivially by playing the move e5. Black has to do something, let's say bishop to e8, and then after e6, it's a trivial Zugzwang. The problem is, this pawn is hanging on g6. I mean, under other circumstances, you could play bishop b5, but here, white can just take this pawn. And this basically means there is no reasonable move. If you go back with the king, white can take on b4, and let's say something like this, king to b6. We just have to avoid playing into this slight trick. So we move around, we go bishop c2 first, the king goes forward, then we pauses a bit like this. And now, if king b6, we are ready to move in this direction. So he can go to a5, but we go there anyway. He gives a check. Now we have this threat of taking on g6. And after bishop e8, we can play the move bishop to d3. And basically, we have completed the Zugzwang. The king has to go back to b6. We go to b4. And next, we can pick up the a4 pawn, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry the line becomes perhaps a little bit long, but they are generally trivial and straightforward. The same what happened in the game after a3, king b6, white goes e5 like this, and e5, and e6, and this is the problem again. And now, the Zugzwang is similar, king a5, king c3, he doesn't get to play b4, and if king a6, king b4, king b6, there is a few moves, opening the position like this, bishop back to this diagonal, and now after bishop e2, there's just no move left. Now this one is completely dead, and if king a6, there is a4, and the b5 pawn drops. So this became a little bit of a mechanically winning bishop ending in the end, but I think the starting position is actually quite interesting. I think part of the problem here, maybe it's not a problem, but our intuition says white is better here, and we have seen examples that, like the game, white wins it. So there is reason for intuitively thinking white is better here, but the king difference, sort of the king being on h1, is actually a huge factor, which black should use for counter-attacking, be it with e6 or be it with f5, or even taking, as I mentioned, the c file and then running towards the center. There is no doubt that black is objectively equal, but as we saw, I think in none of the lines, black ended up on top. On the contrary, it was more difficult to play black. Black had to time things well. And none of the things were trivial. It was easy to sit here behind my screen and show how the computer says you can defend. But it's still not a very pleasant position. But I think, well, if you want to play the Maroczy structure with black, you should obviously understand, well, how do I actually create counterplay? It's important to understand, is a move like e6 just weakening my structure? Is a move like f5 actually attacking his structure, or is it just weakening my king? And it's really gonna depend. But at least for me, I think the key takeaway was that my intuition says white is much better here, but my intuition should pay more attention to the king on h1, which we actually saw limits white's advantage, and vice versa. When you see it from black's perspective, you should think, okay, his king is far away. This is not a permanent weakness, it's a temporary weakness. So I should probably start my counterplay immediately before this one on h1 becomes a dominant piece on d4. I think with these things in mind, we understand the position better. And of course, well, in terms of endings, it was, I think, relevant to realize that there is situations where, I mean, it actually makes sense, despite having less space, to keep pieces on the board, because we saw that in a position like this with a rook on a5, there is counterplay, while the game we had it without rooks, and suddenly there was considerably less counterplay. And perhaps the last nice detail was this idea of playing f6 and f6 and trying to keep well, trying to prevent this weakness happening on g6. And we saw it very clearly in the game that after this, due to this pawn on g6, things were trivially winning. It took a bit of a while, but it was extremely mechanical. So yeah, still some useful info here, I would say, but hopefully black will start getting a better position, because so far it's been a bit sad from black's perspective. Finally, things start to look a little bit more fun for black. And well, the reason I'm smiling is that this position brings back so many childhood memories. Well, this is what I spent my kind of late teens and early 20s on, that I was playing this kind of structure, and my huge idol was Bent Larsen, the big Danish chess hero, who was playing a lot of Maroczys, but especially this one. And I think his point was that, well, black is quite solid, and well, you have put your rooks like this, and they are creating quite some counterplay. If white starts to, let's say, open with a3 and b4, especially this rook is gonna be quite well placed. And while there is no doubt white is somewhat, I would say, slightly better, and so would all manuals say at the time, they would also basically stop and just say white is doing quite well. But they were never explain in details how white should deal with it, because it's not that trivial. I mean, well, even nowadays the computer will just start, let's say, shuffling the pieces back, put them a little bit better. And no, white indeed have a pleasant position, but it felt like, as a specialist with black, you knew how to react to certain things, and this will actually net you quite some results. And the same thing happens in this game. It's Navarra against Jirovsky from Czech in 2003. So Navarra plays the move knight to d5, and that is not ideal, but well, no doubt Navarra knew some of the examples that we have debated previously here. And well, this idea of the c-file opening is supposed to be good for white, but it's not the case here. Of course, you could make a reasonable question, why not just play e6 and sort of expel the knight? Well, I guess the point is that he will argue the pawn on d6 is weak, which it could be to a certain extent, but actually quite sometimes black plays e6 voluntarily himself. So e6 is perfectly possible, but actually black in this specific position likes taking with the bishop on d5. Navarra takes back with the pawn. He has an idea in mind. The computer says, well, e takes d5 is quite a better move. This is not something you typically want, right? Well, you have a queen and a rook sort of lined up in the c-file. It makes perfect sense that you want to open the potential in the c file. So now this seems somewhat misplaced, but actually, well, if white gets the time, let's say bishop f1, the bishop somewhere, let's say g5, white could start doubling in the e file and creating pressure there. This means that black should react to some extent. And I think the computer says the move queen d7 is quite nice. It's looking in the direction of the f5 square, or there will be some counterplay in this direction. It also wants to play the move h5 next, sort of safeguarding the f5 square from g4 happening. And there is even, I would say, after queen d7, we are considering playing a move like e6. I understand that after, let's say, d6, queen takes e6, this pawn will be weak, but there will be considerable amount of activity in the e line to compensate for that. So queen d7 is a nice move when, well, black is slightly worse as he is in the Maroczy, but nothing big. So this is perfectly playable for white, but also quite decent for black. But Navarra had different plans. He takes with the c pawn on d5. And, well, it's gonna sound weird, but this is a great move if it wasn't because it's not. What I mean is that, in general sense, white is better here. I mean, we saw Smets Tivyakov. We saw that this knight on c5 can be very unstable, and white can undermine it with a3, b4, with queen d1 played first. And this is, in general, the same logic here, that if white gets the time, he will expel the knight from c5. And then, well, black's position is just going to be very passive. But quite weirdly, there is a tactic where it's black who is forcing the events. Well, basically, black is forcing white to expel the knight on c5. It sounds completely reversed logic, but it's actually true here. And the point is that the move b4, well, there's a beautiful tactic. We will talk about that. The computer says that maybe you should take an a4. That's what our author mentions. And he says that after rook a4, sure, black has counterplay in the a file, but actually we can play something like bishop b5 and the rook goes back, then a4. And maybe black, it's white who is slightly better here, not black. I think this position is quite balanced, at least. Well, if you are not happy with a position like this, well, don't play the Maroczy, simply. So after a4, the logical move is b4. And now comes this beautiful piece sacrifice knight to b3. What was shocking for me when entering this game with the computer was that actually, even the move knight d7 is extremely reasonable for black. This is not supposed to be the case. Basically, well, this should be a nice version of Tivyakov, Smets against Tivyakov, right? That, well, I was going into length at that. What white really wants is to expel this knight from c5. And that's exactly what happens now. So why is black doing fine here? Well, it depends on specifics. Black would like to play the move a3. Let's say, well, I'm going to make a stupid move now, bishop to g1. Then black will play the move a3. And, well, for a start, he has broken the connection between these two pawns. But also there is the move bishop to b2, which, well, gonna annoy in the c file. Later we can exchange on c2 and go rook c8. And this bishop on b2 is gonna be very powerful, controlling the c1 square. So allowing the move a3 seems to be a mistake. So the logical move is a3. And generally, well, this should be just awesome for white. But it's black to move, and there is a specific. He can exchange on c2 and then go rook to c8. And, well, the idea is to get the rook to c3 with counterplay. White can even take a pawn here, but it doesn't seem to matter that much. You still go rook c3, and there is quite some activity in the c file. A very key tactic is that after bishop to d2, it looks like everything is under control, but black can notch this queen with the knight to b6, threatening it, and the queen has no, well, queen can go to d1, but then the a3 pawn is hanging, or the queen can go somewhere, let's say, active on a5, but then we go rook c2 with counterplay. And, well, black seems to be actually fine after knight d7. This is a little bit shocking and something I've never seen before. But, well, of course, when beautiful sacrifices like knight b3 exist, well, black will do it. It's possible to refuse the gift with queen d1, and then, let's say, takes knight d4. Black is eliminating the pair of bishops and is obviously doing fine. So Navarra took the piece, but very, very beautifully. After a3, black is just a full piece down. There is no material compensation, except for the fact that this pawn is gonna, I would almost say, unstoppably queen. It's not gonna fully be unstoppable, but it's completely sufficient compensation for a piece here, and that is quite shocking in a way, right? It is possible to fight it. Black is not winning by now. The author says that the best way to do it is to play bishop to c4, and then after a2, rook a1. Probably Navarra thought that, let's say, takes b5 wins back the bishop, which is true. For instance, you can't keep being greedy and trying to keep material, because a position like this is actually winning for black. White do have a pair of bishop for the rook, but this pawn on a2 is basically a monster, and there's it's long term, or well, semi-long term, it's just gonna lose. Let's say bishop to d3, then rook a3 starts becoming relevant, and if the b3 pawns drops, one of the bishops will be under attack, and the black starts entering the position. But in this position after b5, white should be realistic and give up the piece. So after rook a2, let's say takes. For the exchange, he will have these two pawns. They could both be strong or weak, but the computer says that with best play, this is a balanced position, and well, both players should be happy with a draw here. So this beautiful counterplay we see is extremely relevant, but it's not winning counterplay like that. But it does win in the game, though. So Navarra, well, probably still couldn't fully believe that sort of black was doing that well. So he tries to keep his material edge. He plays the move rook to c4 instead of putting the bishop there. So Jirovsky plays a2, rook a1, exchange on c4, and he takes with the bishop. Well, you could take with the pawn, but it actually becomes a worse version than what happens in the game. I mean, well, queen f8, like we'll see in the game, queen d1 takes, queen to g7, and I think the difference is that in a position like this, well, now there is no pawn on b3, which means we can play the move rook a4, and well, we will enter sort of into the black camp like this. So he plays the move bishop to c4, takes c4. It looks perhaps weird keeping the double pawns like this, but it's necessary to control the a-file. Now, well, we saw the move already in the line above, but it's a beautiful move. It's queen to f8. Basically, well, this rook is trapped on a1, so it's not really going anywhere. So we're preparing to take it, but only when we have sort of made plans for the next wave of attack. Navarra played queen d1, and the game was take on a1, queen takes a1. Now he played f5 in the game, and while black won the game, perhaps he shouldn't have. Queen g7 is a better move. It's basically trying to smoke the queen out on a1 and then queen the pawn. And of course, you cannot go bishop d4 because we can just take and go a1 and winning easily. Well, there's going to be not background mate because of queen g1, but an easily winning position because of the extra exchange. So after queen g7, white has to defend like this. Bishop to d4, king goes back to f8, and bishop to a1. And it's debatable if black is winning or not, but it's not debatable that it's black who is better here. Of course, if we do this classic material count, it's two bishops against a rook. But again, this pawn on a2 is so relevant and important that it's a borderline that black is winning. And the author says that the best move is probably to play e6. What we want to do is to try and open lines. We want the rook to, well, enter the black camp somehow. He can still prevent it with king g1. And, well, I think the author starts analyzing something like this. Now he wants to play f5 and expand on the king side. He says black is better. But I thought the beautiful line to illustrate sort of how you deal with a pawn like this is that you try to open lines even at a considerable price. So what happens if white takes on e6? Well, the author says rook e8, then bishop goes back. Then you go d5. Well, you can't take with the pawn, obviously, because I'm made on e1. So you take with the bishop, and then you try to get to c1 like this, and after bishop c4, you have to move b5, and you're gonna achieve your target, and you're completely winning. So, yeah, we get to see the power of the pawn on a2 like this. Okay, if this is winning or not is not particularly relevant, but I think it's very crucial to understand that, well, these c takes d5 can be a great move. And even, well, we've seen in endings quite often it's great. We see in the middle game, like we saw in Smed's Tivyakov, then it can be good. We even can see in this particular, in this general sort of position that it can also be good for white. But that there is also some tactics that favors black, and I think this a4, b4, knight b3 is such a beautiful tactic that it's cool that he included this in the book. But again, I'm sorry, I keep smiling, but I spent at least 10 years of my life playing this kind of structure, so I'm happy when it turns out well for black. To be honest, I stopped playing it because, objectively speaking, they're quite pleasant for white, and nowadays people can just turn on their computers, they will see the right plans. But 25 years ago, this wasn't the case, and black would win games like this. So happy memories for me. Thanks. When white puts the knight on d5 and black takes it, we have looked at taking back with the c-pawn leading to a symmetric position. But perhaps a more interesting way is making it asymmetric by recapturing with the e-pawn on d5. And this gives the following structure. It is a more complex structure, and while I said the symmetrical one is either perfectly equal for black or better for white, this one is of course much more doubled edge. If we start looking at it from white's perspective, it's obvious that, well, he still has this kind of spatial edge, right? But now focus is to quite an extent on the E file. Perhaps it's possible to use that for something useful. I mean, you could even argue, isn't the pawn on e7 quite weak? It is, but there's actually an interesting theme that this bishop on g7 very often goes to f6, and somehow a pawn on e7 and a bishop on f6, they protect each other. It was Ben Larsen who told me that sort of a minor piece protected by a pawn, but sort of reprotecting each other is a very useful kind of apparatus, he was calling it. So the e7 pawn, yeah, it is the weakness, it will happen, but it's not kind of the main theme. More typically, the queen side, if white can keep things under control there, he can launch an attack with f4, f5. And this can be quite dangerous for black, actually, because typically black has put, let's say, he has put his rooks on f8 and c8, and this means that his king side will be abandoned, and the king on g8 can turn out to be quite vulnerable in this kind of structure. So here, dynamics very much comes into play. If we look at it from the black perspective, well, now there's many more positive things to say than in the symmetric position. I mean, in the symmetric position, we were generally trying to just be equal by sort of opposing in the c file or perhaps neutralizing the center with e6. Now, for instance, we have a great plan of playing b5, attacking this structure. Sometimes, let's say the white pawn would be in b3, then we would have to play a5, a4, and also creating tension like this. So it's possible very much to push on the queen side. Then it's going to be a race. Will white hit our vulnerable king before we create counterplay on the queen side? And that, as always, depends. Another thing that I remember when playing it as black, it felt kind of counterintuitive to me, but it's actually quite a decent thing, is that you will play the move e6 at some point, and while white takes it, and we're going to take back with a rook, it looks ugly. We're going to have a weak pawn on d6. But quite often we will have activity in the E file compensating for that. So this is perhaps an example of that. Sometimes you will play the move E6, and while structurally it will weaken your position, then we remember that white is actually going quite all in on attacking, and then the E file can be quite a useful way of counterplay. So it is much more interesting and complex in some way when white chooses this structure instead by taking back with the e-pawn. But, well, from white perspective, it's something you do when it's very good, because the downsides are obvious. I mean, we explained black has logical plans here. So it's something white should do with considerable caution. But as we will see in the examples, there is also times where it's really, really good. So let's dig into the examples and have a look at it. Our next game is, well, from the same branch of the Maroczy as in our previous game, but this time we will see some of the white potential. This is quite a crucial opening theoretical position, and in the game, Milomirovic plays the move b6 here in our game against Ninov. This is somewhat passive. The concept we saw in the previous game, and also that I was playing in my youth, was the move queen to b6. Basically, we want to get our rook here to create some kind of counterplay. We saw the effects of that if things turns out beautifully for black in the previous example. White could, let's say, play rook fc1, rook fc8, and now a typical move is rook to c2. And I thought I just wanted to show a peculiar way of black to create counterplay. So you would go like the move queen to b4. Well, you're trying to stop the a3 advance, or so it seems. But actually, you are trying to provoke it. So after queen c1, you would go back with the queen to b6. And after the move a3, you would go to d8. I guess this looks very weird, right? I mean, well, why are we yo-yoing back and forth like this? Well, we actually want to provoke the move a3. Why would we want to provoke a3? Is a3 a weakness? No, the a3 pawn is not weak, but the b3 pawn is to some extent. Maybe we would play a4, and after b4 we would jump into b3. But the logic would then be, well, can't white just play b4? Well, for sure he can, but then we have actually set ourselves up for a considerable amount of counterplay. Our rooks are beautifully posted like this. There is activity down the a file. And this knight can now actually jump to the a4 square. And this position is quite reasonable for black. It's not like black is better, but actually the pieces quite make sense. I think the rooks are connecting well, the queen is a little bit out of the way, and this knight is active, and so is this bishop. And this is, the computer says black is actually quite fine here. I just thought, well, no, I mean, well, everyone liked their youthful memories, right? But I thought this is a quite peculiar concept that was very popular at that time. And, well, but anyway, Milomirovic plays the move b6 instead. So the next move is quite nice from white's perspective. He chose to reroute his bishop. He plays the move bishop to d1. If I remember correctly, then this move was recommended by John Nunn in a sort of classic book called Beating the Sicilians. It was a repertoire book for white that basically claimed that it could show how to play against all kind of Sicilians. This is the kind of books you could do before computers became very strong. And one of them was, I remember he suggested that sometimes you reroute your bishop to c2 in these kind of positions. And here it's quite powerful, and we will see later why. So black plays, passive, or I wouldn't say passive, but useful defensive moves. So rook a7, a3, queen goes to a8. He's basically ready. If b4, then there will be activity in the a file. So white is going to stop playing b4 for now. He puts the bishop on c2, and after rook d8 comes the move knight to d5. I think in the previous example I said that, well, you can perhaps at times just eject the knight like this. Well, here maybe the b6 pawn is hanging. But, well, why not take on d5? It's something that we actually would like to do as black. Here the situation is different. Taking on d5 is kind of dubious. You should probably just, let's say something like queen b8, keep b6 protected, and keep the flexibility. The difference to the last example is, well, here again, if they take back with the c pawn, we're actually gonna get quite a reasonable counterplay down the c file, and with this bishop on c2, maybe black can even play the move b5 himself. But e takes d5 is a strong move. I think we even mentioned it in the previous game, but here circumstances are considerably better. Right there, we had a rook on c2 where it's awkwardly placed. Now we have a bishop who actually points towards the king side, and this rook, for instance, can come to e1 quite soon and be relevant in the e file. It's actually such an unpleasant situation for black that he should consider acting immediately. It's relevant to debate, should black play the move a4? Well, white is going to go b4, and now it could look like this jump is quite relevant, because let's say if you take, which would be a very bad move, then there is immediate counterplay against the pawn on a3 like this. But unfortunately for black, white can play a move like queen to d3. And like this, well, we might be able to pick up this knight later, because it's kind of trapped there. And well, sometime a knight between enemy lines, like a knight on b3, can be very useful, but it can also be very stuck. And I think here it's stuck, and the pawn on b6 is also hanging, and the computer says almost +2 for white. It's possible to play the move like knight to d7, perhaps trying to eye this pawn, but I think if something like bishop d3, rook to c7, it seems like, well, something like, let's say, rook to d1, the next one is going to come here. You can't move the knight to e5 at the moment because b6 is hanging. This is quite an unpleasant position for black. So Velimirovich chooses not to play this move a4 immediately. Black goes knight d7, and actually playing a4 now would be probably even the best. But Ninav plays f4 first, and now the author starts arguing that perhaps the black position is so desperate that you should play the move a4, and the idea is that after b4, rook c7, you can actually create quite some counterplay against the c4 pawn. Let's say, I don't know, he says something like queen e2, rook c8, bishop d3, and now b5 starts creating counterplay. If you take it, the rook will enter the c3 square, and things are not too bad for black. But from our perspective, it's nice that he plays the move queen to c8, because the next move for white I really, really like. And I recall it making quite an impression on me in my youth. I think it was a different example from Polugajevsky, but something very similar. He plays the move a4, and it almost hurts something in me positionally, right? Why would you play a move like a4? You are giving away this beautiful b4 square. I mean, you know, a knight could land there, but you're also giving away the c5 square for the knight, which actually can go quickly, because now you cannot undermine it with b4 anymore. It feels so wrong from a strategical point of view, but it is actually brilliant. The point is that it's sealing the queen side. It's preventing the b5 break. And what you should look at is not potential from this pawn chain of doing something relevant. You should look at it as a perfect blocking sort of utility. It blocks the black counterplay on the queen side, and it gives white free hands to attack on the king side. And this is the key thing here, that it's actually white who has a huge attack on the king side. This bishop is usually posted like this, and later we can play f5 with a huge attack. And there's very, very little black can do against this. For instance, should black choose to play f5, it's quite logical. The knight can follow to f6 next with a blockade. Well, he's not in time. White will blast things open with g4, and even if you take it, you win a pawn, but I'm going to go f5, and your position is basically going to be very, very hard to defend. So a4 is a move that makes... it still makes a huge impression on me. I think it's part of the beauty of chess. I mean, I love harmony. I love sound positions. But this is basically an unsound strategical decision on a local level. But on the global level, it's a crushing decision because it gives you free hands for something that's much more important. And, well, if chess was only simple, easy decisions, chess would be boring. This is actually a very cool decision, and I think this is high level chess, and it was something I really learned something from in my youth, because, well, you cannot just do this sort of local orientation and saying, well, it's easy to understand, it weakens these squares, but there is factors that are bigger, and you have to weigh them against each other, and it's exactly what Ninov is doing here. The game continued rook to b7, rook b e1, rook e8, and now, unfortunately, his next move is not optimal. He plays the move knight to f3. A much better move would be the move f5. For sure, it weakens the e5 square, but after knight e5, white can, let's say, go rook f4. Later, the rook will go to h6, and you start attacking on the king side. I mean, this knight, for sure, is beautiful, but it's not really doing anything relevant. We have the c4 square under control, like this, and basically the black king is going to be squeezed. This is almost a winning attack for white, says the author, and the computer quite agrees. No, I think it makes sense to just dwell a little bit with it, and it's not like you can argue it's a minority attack. It is, of course, to some extent, that you have 3 pawns and black has 4 here, but it prevents any kind of counterplay. It just grabs so much space, and behind this space you can start transferring. I think this rook will go to h4, the other one will go to f1, and basically everything is sort of connecting towards the black king. White is trying to do the same here, but now actually e5 is a very reasonable bit at counterplay. The point is that after rook takes, we start having counterplay in the e-file. We're not talking about black being better. We're talking about black having a fighting chance. Ninov still won the game, but I think it's less relevant for our perspective. But I will just fast forward to the absolutely final move of the game, that in this position. He gets to play bishop takes g6, which is a very, very nice move. The point is that after, well, if you take with the h-pawn, well, you can do like this, and then, if you take with the pawn, then there is f7, and basically you're gonna be able to queen down there. Let's say king h7, we have a check, and then we can take a queen on e8. And if, queen h7, it's gonna be made like this. So I think when you play a nice tactic like this, you should be allowed to sort of see it. So we added a few extra moves there. But for me, obviously, the key move is the move a4. I mean, this it makes a huge impression on me still. That both e takes d5 and the move a4. It looks anti-positional in some sense, but it's grabbing space and using the space to power through with an attack, and that is a very important concept from this game. And then, of course, whenever I'm given a chance, I would try to show something from my youth, and I'm just a little bit in love with this back and forth maneuver, and then creating counterplay in the A file. But that's somewhat less relevant from this sort of game perspective. But I hope you got an idea to sort of see how this structure actually can be quite powerful, because when circumstances is right, there is a huge attack on the king side. It's actually really, black should be in time with counterplay with e6. That we saw in the previous example, that black was much better positioned to break with e6. Here he's not in time, and white can basically manage to sort of make these hammer blows of playing the move a4, fixing the structure, and then, he could have followed up by playing the move f5, and basically, I would say that these sort of pawns stops any kind of counterplay on the queen side. The pawn on f5 and d5 stops the e6 break, and white can just target the black king for free. So a very powerful concept by Ninov here, and not a sort of very intuitive one, at least not for me as a positional player. So I hope it also made an impression on you. In this example, I guess at first sight it looks like quite nice for white, right? We have gotten the knight d5 trick in, and it seems like black will have to take it, because we are both threatening to win an exchange like this and jumping, taking the pawn on e7. But things are quite different here. I guess part of it is that the white rook is on d2 and the black rook is on c8. And it's actually the black rook who is doing something positive, while this rook on d2 is not controlling the c file well. The question is, I mean, are these small advantages for black, or are they very, very relevant? And it's very much the latter. This is a dream come true for black. And I think it's a good example in showing that, well, the tipping point is rather small. This was something that looks similar to what we were told. Please avoid that. But this version is great for black, and perhaps also explains why someone went to this quite sad positions before, because it can be difficult to sort of tell the differences. Here, black is very happy to play the move bishop takes d5. I think earlier we said this just gives up the pair of bishops, but and it does. It just doesn't matter here. If white takes back with the c pawn, he immediately faces trouble with the rook to c1. Basically, black is going to take over the c file, and that is going to be unpleasant. So in the game, white took back with the e pawn. And, well, should black... well, I would say, should white be able to control things? Things might not be too bad for him. Actually, the pair of bishops can start becoming a factor. But black has a very strong move here. It's knight to d7. And, well, the reason I played this so much in my youth was that the white players, to be honest, didn't understand this kind of situations quite well. And I would very often end up with a strong knight against a weak bishop that was sort of blocked by its own pawns like this. And this is exactly what happens here. Generally, white players was told to, well, avoid this exchange of bishops. But that you cannot do now because of bishop c3 winning an exchange. Here, white takes on g7 and the king takes back. And now we can start looking at it, if you look at it from a general perspective, then, well, it's a strong knight, and this bishop is somewhat hemmed by these pawns. Actually, in a modern interpretation, there is lines where these things doesn't matter so much. But I think in terms of when it gets to an ending, it's quite pleasant for black. Now white is really let down with sort of his sense of danger. He should have put his king on f2 now, and then that means that black cannot do this direct aggressive thing we're going to see in the game. Now black would have to play in a more positional manner, let's say a5. It's a nice move. It's sort of controlling the b4 square, which means next the knight can jump to c5 and stand nicely there. And black is doing quite fine. I mean, well, in my youth, I will just skittle out, let's say, a game like this. And then a maneuver would be to put the rook on b6. The other rook will go to a8, and maybe we could push a4 and create something on the queen side. But obviously the white player has been quite friendly here. But king f2 would be a better move. The game was the bishop to e2, and it is still possible to play in this more positional way like a5, but it's not maximizing the black edge at all. What they do in the game is much stronger because they have been granted the opportunity. They play the move b5, and it's basically exploiting tactic. So if you take on b5, we can start interpolating a check on d1. Obviously, you can't go king f2 with the rook hanging, so something like rook to d1. But after takes, it doesn't matter what they take back with the king. Then after a b5, we have counterplay against a2. And after bishop takes b5, threatening our knight on d7, we take on a2 anyway, because we're going to threaten rook a1, winning this rook. And then the knight can jump to c5 or e5 again, and black is just clearly better here. So b5 is tactically possible, and it's quite positionally desirable. White realizes that his king is exposed on e1 and goes king f2. And, well, my positional instincts would be to play b4. I want to have a knight on c5 next. I want to play a5, a4, and squeeze like this. This is a good, let's say, static understanding of chess. I mean, I'm a very positional player. I care a lot about understanding a position from a static positional point of view. And would I be able to make this move I just mentioned? Things would be fine. White should realize that if he doesn't act immediately, he's going to really be squeezed, as I showed you. So he should play the move a3, and after, well, takes, then rook to a1, let's say knight to c5, rook to a3, and after rook cb8, he can defend with bishop to d1. Black is still doing quite fine, but the king will probably enter like this, and even if I get to play a5 and have a strong knight on c5, it's still quite solid in a way. So this is perfectly fine for black. It looks nice, it's slightly better, but black rightly chooses to take on c4 because this is actually much more concrete. In the game, he takes with the pawn, and then basically we are getting what I was dreaming of, this very stable knight going to c5, but with also the b file open under much better circumstances for black. It would have been somewhat better to play taking on c4 like this, but after knight b6, let's say bishop e2, rook c5, this pawn is weak now, and well, black can start pushing with a5 and creating further weaknesses, and have, I would say, quite good winning chances. But of course, after b to c4, it's even worse. Black cleverly flicked in rook ab8, taking the b file first, and after moves, let's say, like this, he had a much better, I would say, close to winning position. We saw before that, well, in my line, black also had a beautiful position, but here he has a beautiful position. He can directly do something to improve, and there is weaknesses in the black camp, in the white camp, but black is close to winning here. So I think, well, this is a good example of black's potential, but also I really like that, you know, things look so similar, but still are quite different. It sounds weird that a structure where, well, knight d5 happens, that normally you would say it's only small tipping points. White is slightly better, it's equal, but here not at all. We have seen white being much better, and here we see black being considerably better. But that's just makes it more interesting. We have to understand the details. And here, well, especially this move knight to d7, forcing this very desirable exchange of dark squared bishops, and then later the knight will settle on the c5 square. It should have been only, let's say, slightly better like this for black, but of course, due to bishop e2, he allowed the move b5, and we saw how black can basically be strategically winning like this. So I think a nice example, sort of counterbalancing our understanding of that this knight d5 structure is not always good for white. It's often good for white, but it can also be quite promising for black. Our next game is, again, this very typical variation. It's Pavlovich against Leon Hoyers from 2012. And, well, the plan for white is generally described that, well, rook ab1 is a good move. It's sort of preempting the queen going to b6. And next we're going to go rook fc1, perhaps go back with our bishop. And, well, like that, we are solidifying our position, and we will sort of act upon circumstances later. I think it's a good example of why is it so difficult and at times also wrong to describe plans for a player, because just a small detail and circumstances would change dramatically. In the game, black plays the move e6, and this is actually a moment where we should say, okay, what I just said about white's plans, forget about it. Pavlovich is unable to do that, and I can't blame him, because I have done more or less the same mistakes in Larsen against in a similar position, and I also got mated like him. What we should see here is that the move e6 is quite a dramatic change. It creates this structural weakness on d6, and black is very much changing his strategy from being, let's say, cautious on the queen side and keeping a healthy structure, to rather having a structure with a weakness but some attacking potential. And the moves I described before, let's say rook fc1, bishop f1, which is going to happen in the game, they are very much based on black playing this cautious approach. They are a good idea. But e6 is a more dramatic change than one would think. and that basically means that white should start acting like that on that. The author says that well, rook fd1 would be a better move, and after bishop e5, you want to play the move bishop to d4, and then it's not like you necessarily want to exchange immediately, but there is the option of exchanging at some point. And generally, the rook is not supposed to go to d1, but to c1. But that's very much when black plays positionally. When this changes, it's much more relevant having the rook in the d file. Actually, it's so relevant that the computer says, maybe you should use this rook. It looks weird, right? We just played the move rook a to b1. And after black playing the move e6, we simply want to move this rook again. Move this rook again like this to put pressure on the d6 pawn. But it's simply because the move e6 has changed the structure quite dramatically. Now perhaps we want to put the rook on f2, play bishop f1, g3, and expand like this. So that will be quite interesting. But Pavlovich, well, he does like he's told to do. He plays rook f to c1, bishop e5, bishop to f1. These looks like quite relevant moves in terms of well, solidifying the white position. But it's sort of it's very much aimed at the queen's side. It's aimed at perhaps pushing like this later, and this underestimates black's attacking potential. It could be possible to play the move f5 already now, but what black is playing a useful developing move first, queen e7. And after the move rook c2, now he pushes with f5. And I think, well, when I was playing the Maroczy, I thought, is there any kind of logic behind that you can start attacking with? You have less space, and quite of some of your positions are aimed at the queen side. And I thought generally this plan of e6 bishop e5 looked a little bit dubious. Also the plan of playing the move f5. Well, I don't really like it, but that's a personal preference. I mean, both moves like e6 and f5, they are somewhat weakening. But, well, I got hurt once by Larsen, who made it me, and we see what happens to Pavlovich here, that there is quite some potential in the black position. So white takes on f5 and rook takes f5. And now it's quite difficult. What should you do? This bishop is pointing in this direction. It could be tempting to say, why don't we play f4 immediately? But that is a very peculiar tactic. Bishop takes c3 actually wins an exchange. It's perhaps quite easy to see that if you take with the rook, then there is knight e4 with this fork. But if you take with the queen, there is bishop e4, which is considerably more unusual, but it actually wins an exchange in this diagonal. So here, this strange small tactic doesn't really work in white's favor. He tries to exchange the bishops like this on d4 to sort of get rid of this strong bishop, but rook f8 happens. Now, maybe, well, you could take on e5, but actually black doesn't want to sort of positionally take back. In the book, he mentions that taking with the pawn like this is quite strong, and next you're going to follow up with e5 with counterplay. I mean, a very basic point is that you can still play e4 here, because after takes, you can't take here because it's just made with rook takes f1, right? So tactics starts to work in black's favor, which perhaps is not unreasonable, with the sort of pieces being stuck on the queen side when black is attacking towards the white king. He could play rook d1 and things would not be too bad. But had that happened, this game wouldn't have ended up in this book. Black is still completely fine. But after knight e2, the game is shockingly basically over. There is often, you have seen this bishop takes h7 tactics. That it actually works here, taking on h2 is a little bit surprising. But takes, so check, and queen to h4. White actually resigns. It took me a little bit of time to realize, why on earth would he resign here? What is even the threat? But the threat is, that this potential of queen h2 is basically crushing. directly, it would perhaps not be totally deadly, but it threatens to play, let's say, rook takes f3 first, and you can't take back because then you are mated on h2. There is also the threat of knight to e4, attacking the queen, but also covering the f2 square. And if you take on e4, then queen h2 is made again, because you have a rook in the f-file. And basically, there's absolutely no reasonable way to defend against rook takes f3 and against knight e4. So in this position, Pavlovich resigned. And it's a powerful example, I would say, in terms of, well, I really like this idea that, well, in chess, yes, we have plans, but a plan cannot be described fully, like you do this, then you do that next, and so on and so forth. I remember an example of Yarmolinsky trying to describe it in, I forgot the name of the book, but he was describing the sort of modern understanding of, what is it called, minority attack. He said that, well, white has 4 plans like here. You know, you might play b4, b5, but you might also play f3, e4. You might play e4 directly, and so on and so forth. He was really saying that you are trying to stay flexible and act upon circumstances. And this is a little bit the same here, that if white just thinks, okay, I'm gonna do this, this, and this next, irregardless of what black's gonna do, well, black might exploit that. And of course, that he gets to exploit it to this extent is a little bit much, but it's quite interesting. And this idea of the move e6 being such a structural changer that you are actually willing even to take this rook you just moved and move it again. Well, that was obviously too hard for Pavlovich, and it was also it's even too hard for me now. It feels so illogical, but it actually strikes me as being true. And that is quite interesting. Well, this plan with e6 obviously got followers. Well, first Larsen busted me, then there was this game, and so on. And it's quite an interesting way of playing it. But it does come with some positional risk, and we will see that the move f5, while it worked beautifully in this game, in others it has just turned out to be weakness. But we'll return to that in one of the upcoming games. As advertised, there was an example coming up, sort of countering the impressions we just got about this f5 advance. In the previous game, we saw black playing f5 and giving actually quite quickly mate to the white king. And I think both the author as well as me, we really think this has to be counterbalanced, because what we just saw in the previous game was rather the exception than the rule. I think this is a good example to sort of balance it. At first sight, perhaps it looks like black is doing quite well. There is activity down the f-file, there's a strong knight on f4, and even, well, the rest of the pieces are quite well placed. But that is somewhat deceptive. I would say that, well, it's actually white has activity in the e-file where it's attacking something real. There is a weakness to attack. As well, this bishop is well placed and it's stable. You cannot just remove it. While this knight on f4, it looks nice, but white can just attack it. White in the game, white played the move g3, and basically this, good-looking knight is being pushed back. Part of the reason is that knight h3 check, king g2, knight to g5. There's nothing wrong with taking on c6, but we can even stand on the d5 square first. And well, we're about to play f4 next, and this beautiful knight on f4 is just being pushed back while white is making useful moves. So after g3, Karnofsky chose to play the move knight to h5, and white continued with f4. And I think by now already it's clear that what black has achieved by playing f5 is mainly weakening his structure. It's white who's actually threatening to push due to what happened with f5. It's not black who gets activity. You can argue that there is also the problem of having free pawn islands, but I think that is almost a little bit too generalistic. The main problem is that white is threatening to play the move f5, and it's going to leave black in quite some disarray. And of course also that this bishop is powerfully standing in the center, and there's nothing you can do about that. Is very uncomfortable for black. The game was knight to g7, knight to e3. Perhaps the best remedy of stopping the f5 advance would to put a knight on f5 himself. Now the author makes an interesting suggestion. It's also the top computer line. He says to play the move bishop to take c6. It's very peculiar to give up voluntarily this very strong bishop. But that's actually one of the reasons people say that why is bishops generally better than knights? I mean, not a lot better, but a bit better. It is that there is this scenarios where it's typically more flexible with the bishop being able to take the knight at will than the other way around. And here it's a good example of that. Generally, of course, we wouldn't exchange on c6. But when the circumstances are right, we want to. And this is, yeah, exactly what the case here. The point is you cannot take back with the rook, because then after knight d5 threatening the queen, when the queen retreats, you have to move g4, which basically undermines the weakness on e7. So after bishop takes c6, you have to take back with the pawn. But then after knight takes f5, you again have to take back with the pawn to sort of ensure that the queen is still protecting the e7 pawn. And this structure is generally quite weak. After rook e3, we are threatening to double, not only to attack the e5 pawn, but also to attack the e6 square. And black is in huge structural trouble. But it is still perhaps the lesser evil than what happens. Because in the game, he chose to ignore the threat of f5. And after queen f7, f5, basically black is close to lost here. Part of the problem is that if you try to keep the position closed with the g5, then after knight d5 there's no reasonable way to sort of stop the f6 advance, because we are threatening to take on g5, and when you protect it, then basically f6 is killing. So after f5 he chose to play gf5, but knight takes f5. It's just horrible, and I think the game the game didn't finish, but there is the threat of rook takes h7 winning the queen, and after rook f7 bishop d5 was winning an exchange, and the game quite easily. So I hope that I understand that for the romantics of you, what you saw in that last game with these beautiful sacrifices, it will always feel attractive. But at least this game is exemplifying how I generally see this f5 advance. Something that quite ruins the black structure, and that if white plays reasonably, then he's not going to get mated. And yes, there is many examples where he does, but well, you're not going to face me on a daily basis. And also I lost it once to Larsen, so hopefully I will not make the same mistake again. And that it's important that you understand that playing f5 is really playing with strategic risk in this position. And I think this one exemplifies it quite well, because the position is deceptive. The black activity is not really there, and the knight on f4 especially is going to be pushed back rather than being a powerful entity. So I really hope that this example, perhaps more than the previous one, is the one that makes an impression. In our next game, our author wants to show a certain theme where black eventually breaks with b5. But I thought I would hijack the subject a little bit to show some of the basics of the Maroczy. After all, it's a favorite opening of mine, as announced quite some times. So the Maroczy quite typically arises from what's called the accelerated dragon in the Sicilian. In the normal dragon, black will play the move d6 first and then g6. But here he's playing it a little bit quicker. And this means that white gets the option of playing the move c4. Well, if we compare it, let's just show the actual dragon. The point is here, we play the move knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4, and only after knight c3 we play the move g6. When we are accelerating things like this, white gets the extra option of playing the move c4, and well, there he gets the so-called Maroczy structure, giving this space advantage we have debated quite in depth so far. I was always playing the move bishop g7, and this is what Chang Pengshang is doing as well. But quite some of the examples we have seen comes from the move order knight f6. The idea is, well, here we attack the e4 pawn again directly. White obviously has to defend it, but then we play the move d6. And this is a little bit of a tricky move order, because the idea is that would white play the very natural move bishop to e3, we have knight g4, which actually annoys quite a lot. So in this position, well, maybe bishop e2 is the normal move, but what we saw quite was playing the move f3 first. But either if they go bishop e2 or f3, the black point is that, well, we want to take on d4 before whites get to play the move bishop to e3, so that white cannot recapture with the bishop. Maybe it feels a little bit odd, like developing the white queen like this, but well, after bishop g7, it's quite useful that it's the queen that's exposed on d4, not a bishop that's opposing. So the idea is that, well, we sacrifice a bit of time, allowing the queen to take on d4, knowing that it actually has to retreat later. So the games we saw was like this. Now, well, we can see that actually the queen has had to retreat. And after queen a5, rook c1, bishop e6, well, this position we have covered in quite some games. Remember, Polagiewski played knight d5. He won a beautiful ending after the exchange, but we also know that queen takes a2 is possible. So the later game we saw was b3. This is what Smets was playing against Tivyakov. And well, there you really have to go rook fc8. What Tivyakov did was sort of playing a6 first when knight d5 was very strong. But rook fc8 is the move. And I think I told you that, well, bishop e2, a6. Now knight a4 is the main theoretical move, which is correct. It gives some kind of ending like this, knight d7, and white probably goes g4 here. But I noted that in this position, actually the computer, computers are less dogmatic. Why develop with bishop e2 first? It actually suggests the move g4 in this position. I think this is quite reasonable. And after a6, well, the idea was not to give mate. Well, then black actually has counterplay with b5. No, the idea is still to take this ending. So knight a4, takes. And due to the threat of knight b6, well, black has to go knight to d7. And now we've achieved to get to play g4 instead of the move bishop e2. And, well, I would like to argue that this is an achievement. It stops the move f5. But, of course, the computer undermines my point of view. It says maybe I should play bishop e2 here, anyway transposing to a normal theoretical position. But that was a few details of why, well, black goes knight f6 quite often here and tries to force white to take back with the queen on d4. Just so you understand how the different sort of scenarios arises, I thought it was relevant to sort of explain that. So in this game, goes bishop d7, white goes bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, covering the e4 pawn, castles bishop e2, d6. In this Wang Shili Shangpengchang game, white does this quite weird move, rook to c1. Castling is by far the more normal move, and typically black would then play the move bishop to d7. I think, well, we have seen examples arising, well, something like this. Then black would put the bishop on c6, white would go f3. Now we would be a bit afraid of them playing b4, so we go a5. Then they would think, okay, are they going to go a4? Then they're going to go b3. We're going to go knight d7. They would kind of, for black's perspective, exchanging the dark squared bishops is somewhat an achievement. So the bishop normally goes back, then knight c5, and let's say rook a b1, this position we had previously. This is how this position arises. But sort of modern understanding has changed a bit. At some point, partly because of me doing a chapter in a book, knight c2 sort of got more popular. Well, it's definitely not my invention. I had the black pieces against the Gulko, who played this move knight c2 against me, and I got a very unpleasant position. And he told me that it was kind of some kind of not old wisdom, but sort of knowledge that, well, in these Maroczy positions, actually keeping all four minor pieces can quite help white, because black's positions get kind of crowded. And while, I mean, you can of course argue this is a retreat, it really helps keeping extra pieces. And that was, I got a bad position, but luckily for me, he made an inaccuracy and we made a peaceful draw. But part of this sort of chapter that I wrote in this book was explaining the paradox that I think in the Maroczy structure, it's kind of weird. White would like to keep all pieces on the board, but also he would like to exchange all pieces on the board. There is some famous games where it's just queen and rooks in this structure, but winning is winning some nice game there. Well, this is kind of a paradox that we saw it a little bit also when we spoke about the headshot. If I can give general advice, should we exchange all the pieces? Should we keep them on? It becomes a little bit difficult. I would say, well, here in the Maroczy, I would say 4 or 0 minor pieces is pretty good for white. But of course, it's too generalistic. But it's still important to understand the complexities of that. Black is cramped, and being cramped can mean 4 minor pieces is too much, but having no pieces for counterplay is actually somewhat uncomfortable. I will say that, well, in this position, Black has tried to do it well because, well, the idea is that all his minor pieces actually have quite useful functions, while a second knight, it's very hard to point to a square where it would be useful. So basically, Black wants to change the right amount. But, well, of course, we always want to do the exact right thing, right? So because of knight c2 being popular, there was also starting to debate. Maybe we can take on d4 and go bishop d7 first, and then so on and so forth. You can go, I mean, well, you can go back even to, for that matter, this position. Maybe we should play the move knight c2 before they can exchange here. And even in this line with knight f6, knight c3, d6, it's quite possible to play the move knight to c2. But the sort of example with me with Gulku, I have already played the move bishop to d7. So here, for instance, bishop d7, bishop e2, that comes this interesting move knight to d7. You want to put the knight here. And this becomes more harmonious. Actually, you don't really need to sort of move the bishop from the c8 square. White now often plays the move bishop to d2 because after castling, well, bishop takes c3 is actually quite reasonable. Of course, we are giving away our dream of a bishop. But these pawns are quite weak, and you can put a knight on c5, a bishop to e6, a rook to c8. Somehow things are quite solid, and especially, well, this beautiful knight we get on c5 is going to give us quite some stability. So in this position, typically white goes bishop to d2, black goes knight c5, castles, and now if you castle, white can play the move b4. It's a pawn sacrifice, but positions like this, the general consensus is that this bishop and sort of the potential counterplay against the black king is more than sufficient compensation for a pawn. And perhaps in this position, we might consider playing the move a5 to sort of stop the b4 push. Anyway, this is sort of the basics, at least. Returning to this position, I also said castling bishop d7. Well, this exchange is going to happen on d4 if black can do it, and we saw that the general consensus was that white plays like this and then protects with f3. But sort of kind of based on modern computers, it turned out that it's not necessarily how the position be played. Nowadays, the move h3 is very popular, and it's surprisingly strong. I say surprisingly because I'm just so brought up with that in this position, after bishop c6, we want to play the move f3 to block this bishop. But apparently, well, that is not really the case. You can play the move queen c2, and you can argue you didn't have to weaken your king position a bit by playing the move f3, and the pawn on h3 is quite useful. The idea is, again, if knight d7, well, now we can probably exchange and play the move b4. So after here, you probably want to go a5, but then white is not really going to play b3 to stop the a4 advance, because after rook a d1, a4, c5 has turned out to be quite pleasant for white. And while Generally, well, we don't want to, I mean, we were so proud of having our center, right? But here it turns out that we can provoke some weaknesses in the black position, and white is quite better. So you see here a bunch of specific sort of overruling the old, more dogmatic understanding of the Maroczy structure. I'm sorry if I rushed a little bit over it, but of course it's a lot of material to cram in sort of as a sort of starter of a game. In this game, rook c1 happened, and that is actually an inaccuracy. Well, it reminds me of this position where Bent Larsen was playing the move rook e8 at some point. I even think he managed to beat Nigel Short here. Larsen's point was that, well, I want to sort of tease white a little bit. What is he going to do next? Let's say he go queen d2. I might consider the move knight g4, because now, well, I can take back on g4 in one move with my bishop. So if white doesn't want to play the move queen d2, why not play the logical move rook c1? But this was exactly Larsen's point, that now he wants to play knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then this peculiar move bishop to h6. It hits the rook. And the point is, if you move the rook, we're gonna go e5, and well, your bishop is trapped. Trapped is too strong. It's not losing a piece. But after this, well, while this pawn is weak, so are these, and I think the computer says it's quite equalish, and Larsen thought this was an interesting position. Of course, there's many moves. There's knight c2, but at least now maybe we can consider going in this direction, although it's still quite promising for white. Of course, a move like rook e8 cannot be, it's more like, it's creative. It's not a winning move in any way. But here, after rook c1, actually, had he, Zhang Pengshang knew this last idea, probably after knight d4, bishop d4 in the game, he would have played the move bishop to h6. The computer says that's just a great move here, because, well, what should you do? You actually, well, he's threatening to win the exchange. You can't even play f4 because it's just hanging. So you have to move the rook to c2, and after e5, bishop e3, takes. Well, black has just an excellent position. I even say that the rook is much better placed on f8 because it's protecting the f7 pawn, while Larsen was willing to put the rook to e8 just to provoke this. So I thought bishop h6 is a nice addition, just sort of to, even in kind of passive setups, there can be certain tactics. Anyway, now finally to the promised game. He played the move bishop to e6. And Vasily plays a very stereotypical move here. He plays the move queen d2, but it's actually not a good square for the queen. That's probably going to sound weird, because we saw a bunch of examples where the queen was on d2. But there, well, the queen had been on d4 and was returning to the d2 square, as I tried to explain earlier, right? So in this position, white should just castle. And if queen a5, like in the game, white should actually grab even more space. It's possible to play the move f4, and after, let's say, rook fc8, creating a threat here, we're just going to defend it. And if black tries to play a6, white can play the move bishop to f3. It starts threatening in this diagonal, and let's say rook ab8 is logical. Then after e5, the black position is very cramped, and if you do something like this, there's going to be tactical sort of problems in this direction. So white should understand that actually the black concept here has been somewhat flawed, and he should try and punish it. What Vasily does is that he actually plays a move that very much normalizes the situation. He basically gets into some kind of things that looks familiar, but it helps black massively. Now suddenly black is quite okay. He is in time to play queen a5, and after f3, rook fc8, b3, he plays the move a6. And now suddenly it's quite unpleasant for white. An important detail is that, for instance, if you play the move knight a4, it looks like a blunder, because you can take here, and in the previous examples the bishop was on e3. Now it's on d4, which means knight takes e4 is possible. Quite weirdly, it's almost good for white. White can play the move king to e3. And the idea is that, well, if you take on g7, I'm going to take back with my king. And actually, I'm threatening to take your knight, but I'm also threatening a fork here. So white is quite better. Quite brilliantly, black has the move bishop to h6 check. And the idea is that, well, if you take on f5, I assume that in this position there is mate, although I'm not strong enough to calculate this on my own. What I'm strong enough is to say that I have minimum a perpetual, and that's good for me. Now I feel safe, and should this position appear, I will try to think hard. But well, this is a course, so I'm not gonna do that. White can play the move f4 here, well, the computer says after f5, knight b6, there is sufficient compensation for an exchange. The king is exposed. Maybe the bishop will move and we will have threats like e5 with counterplay. Anyway, so knight a4 is surprisingly possible, but not obviously that great. It allows this tactic for black. In the game, he castles, which is just a bad move. The best move would be bishop to e3. But now black is still in time to play the move b5. And, well, let's say this ending appears, then this is a pretty good version for black. He's ready in the c-file, so there is no sort of direct threats there. And he's also managed to move his weaknesses on the king side forward. We have seen sometimes when they manage to get stuck. But here, it is basically a very pleasant version for black. Pleasant to the extent that he's almost equal. Maybe white could try an exchange and then let's say go rook c1. And in a position like this, I think it should generally be quite easily a draw. But if black becomes very passive, then potentially, I don't know, if the king could walk in, let's say, this direction, it would be pretty horrible. Or yeah, perhaps more realistically, somehow preparing the a4 advance, but it seems like, well, black is actually ready to take it. Even so, both the computer and the author says that e6 is quite a good move. And I think that's correct. I think the idea is if you take, you will play like this, and you will try to, with d5, basically eliminate any kind of white spatial advantage. Okay, back to the game. He makes the move castles, and then our author gets to show what he really wants, that this b5 potential is obviously part of black's position. It doesn't happen that often, but that's because white is aware of it and tries to preempt it. It has to be understood that for black, getting to advance b5 can be very favorable. The reason we don't see it in top-level chess that often is that, well, white simply suppresses it. Well, in the game, there is the threat of taking on c4, right? So he takes on b5. The author actually says that the lesser evil would be to play bishop e3, and after takes, actually things are not too bad. The point is that if you go bishop c4, then knight d5 is actually quite a reasonable move. The small tactic is that, like here you can take on e7, and when you go king f8, then bishop takes d2, quite funnily enough works, because if you take on e2, then c8 will be hanging, and if you take on e7, then c4 will be hanging. So white is still better here. A positional player like me will say that, well, we don't need to take this pawn. It's a weakness. We would probably try to block it with something like knight d7 and exploit the c5 square, and black is doing fine. But it is a lesser evil than what actually happens. So the game was b5, takes. And now, well, let's just appreciate from black's perspective what has happened. The strong pawn on c4 has disappeared, right? We've basically exchanged it with an a6 pawn, which suddenly means that it's not like white doesn't have space advantage. You can argue he still has the pawn on e4, but it's become much less relevant, and well, it's become much less broad, but also much less relevant. This pawn on b5 also gives black some space, and there's the threat of pushing it to b4. It's a major sort of change in structure, and from black's perspective, you're already trying to look to be better. Well, we can see what happens in the game. He goes rook fd1, just playing normal chess, and after b4, I guess you can't go to d5, it's just gonna lose a pawn. So after knight a4, he plays rook cb8. The author says that knight d7 is an even better move. Here, you are quite happy to exchange these pieces. And what you really like is that, well, this knight is defending the b6 square, which means the knight on a4 starts to become very stuck. Well, this also happens in the game. He just avoids the exchange of rooks, and now it's true, the author says that bishop c4 would have been a better move, but let's sort of ignore that just to get the more structural points. So bishop f1, knight d7 happens, and in this position, black is just better. Well, as I mentioned, this central sort of advantage white has doesn't matter a lot. What matters is perhaps, I would say, these weaknesses and that this knight is misplaced. What black is going to do next, I'm not fully sure. Well, you could even at some point start, let's say, moving the king backwards to have it a little bit safer. Well, he does have a threat that white falls into. White plays the move queen to e1, which is basically just a blunder, because while in general we want to, well, keep this knight stuck on a4, right now you can play the move knight b6, and when you take it, we take back with check, and next comes rook takes a2, and black is just winning and won the game easily. So yeah, I wouldn't say I'm sorry for sort of hijacking the agenda, because I really wanted to talk about some of the opening details in this sort of Maroczy structure. But well, the general message, of course, was that well, this b5 advance, it's something we have to understand is a major achievement if circumstances are right. From a structural point of view, of course it shoots. I mean, this is the Maroczy bind, and it's called a bind for a reason. It's something that really sort of suppresses black's play. And if black can manage to break the bind, it's like, well, his pieces comes to life, but I would more say his structure comes to life. As we saw, well, this structure is just very pleasant for black, while, yeah, I keep mentioning white still have some space advantage, but it's a very sort of unproductive space advantage, and the reality is that there is just weaknesses on the queen side, and it's certainly black who can play for a win here. So I thought that, well, I hope you sort of grasp the value of the b5 break, but I also hope that you thought my sort of ramblings about the sort of details of the opening in the Maroczy was a little bit interesting too. The final game of this chapter is sort of this very typical Maroczy position. We've debated it a bit before, and I think, well, what I really recall from my youth was everybody would say white is slightly unpleasantly better here, but it was very difficult to find these kind of clean model game that I will explain how should white deal with these positions. And quite often it ended up pretty well for black, or it got murky on the way. And I really like that our author gives it a shot for having this model game, but even this one gets a little bit murky. It's black to move here, and you can see that both players has sort of done the very standard things. I mean, black has sort of looped his queen over to c8, which means the black queen has first been to b6 and then back like this. It's basically a very sound defensive setup. These rooks are very much sort of ready to sort of do relevant counterplay should white push on the queen side. White has sort of insinuated this push on the queen side by having rooks on c1, on c2 and b1, and his last move is putting the bishop back to f1, sort of safeguarding his position. The question is, what's going to happen next? And this is a relevant question for both sides. The author mentions that the typical move for black is the move h5, which is kind of true. And also, being a Larsen fan, he was advocating that this is an interesting move. It grabs space, and perhaps I don't know if it sort of insinuates going further, but not really. That's more in the headshots. It's more like we want to have our structure like this. You can argue it's a little bit of a weakness, but I think it's generally a quite useful move. But perhaps black's problem is also that in this position, he's basically done any kind of useful move he would like. He's ready to react to what white does, but to do something positive on your own, it's quite difficult. You can argue for e6. but it weakens the d pawn. You can argue for h5, but it weakens the g6 pawn. So in our game, he chooses to make a less committal move. He plays the move bishop to e5. And white, I mean, it's basically the reverse of what we see in the hedgehog structure. There I argued that the problem at times is that white has done everything useful he would like, but still he cannot break through, while black can keep improving his position. Here it's reversed. White can actually do something useful, but on a small scale. So white plays the move g3. He just wants to put his bishop on g2, where it sort of starts covering the e4 pawn, which means potentially we could play f4. Perhaps not immediately, but g3 is a nice move. It vacates the g2 square for the bishop, and on g3 also the pawn has a little bit more influence on, let's say, the center of the board. So it's just a sound, useful move. Black then plays the move h5, perhaps insinuating h4 at some point, and white does bishop to g2. Now black is really stuck for a move. It's not like white has a threat, because should white play the move f4, we can actually take on c3 and then win the pawn on e4. So there's no immediate threat. But it's more like black lacks something to do. King h7 is what he does, and that's seen as a very common move. It's not like we are preparing any attack in the g file. We're just putting the king on what we think is a slightly more useful square. It does, however, weaken the f7 pawn, which is unprotected. And, well, that can sound almost like a joke, but as we will see, it does matter at times. I mean, it's kind of amazing that any kind of unprotected pawn or piece somehow often ends up being relevant, right? White continues here, just playing useful moves. Rook to e1, slightly improving the position. Well, the rook on b1 was sort of, trying to push like this. But in this position, we will actually rather keep this as a completely sound structure where the pawns are protecting the next pawn like this. And we don't want to push b4 here. Actually, our idea is to push in the center now. The author recommends playing the move b6, saying it's not really a weakness, and perhaps it also connects a little bit in this direction, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's a standard move, nothing wrong with that. What he does is also quite useful. He plays the move queen f8. I want to pay attention to the move queen to h8. This I remember Larsen was playing, and he thought that, well, this is some kind of cool way to actually sort of connect and create some kind of activity in the long diagonal. It's not directly relevant immediately, but it's kind of useful. I mean, you could even consider flicking the king back to g8, protecting the pawn on g7 next. However, it's not that efficient here. I think white can play the move knight to d5. There is now a threat on e7 and on b6 with a fork. And should you play a move like queen to d8, I think we can consider playing f4 immediately, although that should also be mentioned that quite sometimes white will play the move bishop to g5, attacking the pawn on e7, and if black has to play f6, it weakens the structure on the king side quite considerably. So knight d5 is unpleasant. The best move is probably to take on d5, but then after queen d5, as I mentioned, the f7 pawn is actually hanging. It's true, black can play e6, but we're gonna go back with our queen, and I would say that the exchange of the c3 knight against the c6 bishop is probably quite nice for white. White will prepare f4, and with the pawn on h5, it means g6 is somewhat weakened, so we will start attacking with f5. The computer says white is pleasantly better here. So queen f8 striking me as quite a reasonable move. But again, white pounds with the move knight to d5. In the game, he goes knight to d7, covering the b6 square. But our author spends a considerable amount of time to debate, well, what happens if bishop takes d5. One of his points is that e takes d5, as we saw in one of these games, I forgot which one actually, is not that great now. The computer somewhat disagrees. He says that queen g7, f4, bishop f6 is a very solid position for black. And I think that is true it's difficult for white to do something very directly. That would typically be, let's say, well, he argues if white should push f5, then you can meet it with g5 quite often and keeping things closed. And, well, h3, g4, maybe it's possible, but even there, we can probably exchange and play g5 ourselves under the right circumstances. So there is some truth in that this position is quite solid for black, even if it's somewhat sad. There's nothing positive you can do, but it's not so easy for white, that's true. He also makes the point that after bishop takes d5, probably white should play the move c takes d5. That is actually quite wrong, but for a very peculiar reason. He has a decent argument that if queen d8, we go rook e to c1, and then we will consider with queen d1, a3, b4, like Smith's. But he's missing a peculiar tactic. a4 is, of course, met by b4, but then knight b3 is possible. You can say he should have seen this tactic. He's actually the one who's introduced this to us a couple of examples back. But there is a considerable twist. After a takes b3, the computer wants to play take back. And the idea is that after rook takes c8, queen takes c8, simply the combined threat of rook a2, as well as putting the pawn on b2, seems to be worth a piece. The position is kind of equal according to the computer, and quite good for black, surprisingly. What I paid attention to, that it's there's actually another possibility. It is possible to play rook takes c2, queen takes c2, a3, just playing for this passed pawn. At first sight, it looks like, can't you just play the move queen a2? But then black goes bishop to b2. And quite shockingly, the computer says this position is just equal. Maybe it's almost like a positional fortress, that the white queen needs to stay there to keep these things under control. At first I was wondering, can't you just play bishop c1 and eliminate the bishop? But then after queen g7, black is already better. He's a full piece down. But this pawn on a3 is so powerful. And no, I just thought that this was very fascinating, that even here, white has to look out for this knight b3 tactic. It's not like white is lost or anything like this. He wasn't in our sort of a previous example of this tactic. But it's a very relevant tactic that pops up, and it's puzzling that this a-pawn is so strong. But of course it has something to do with black having control of the sort of promotion square. So taking with the c-pawn is actually wrong, but for tactical reasons. The best move is to take with the queen, it seems. And, well, there is no direct threat to f7 as it was with the queen on h8. But sooner or later, probably black has to play e6 anyway, and we get a position like this, which is quite pleasant for white. Sure, black is somewhat solid, but I think in connection with this f5 break, it's really unfortunate we have the pawn on h5, because then g6 becomes weak. I'm not making an argument for black being lost or even clearly worse here, but it's a pleasant position for white, no doubts. So knight d5, knight went back to d7, covering the b6 square. Now he plays f4, and well, we see that having the bishop on e5 perhaps looks nice, but due to sort of this g3 and bishop g2 plan, right, then simply it gets pushed back. In this position, the author makes a point of that white now goes king h1, and he says he should react immediately with f5. That is quite reasonable, but I guess it's here when my point comes in that, well, there is these games that we try to portray as model games for white, but they always end up as a mess. And the line he's giving is e6, and let's say, yeah, taking g6, take back, rook f1, threatening the queen, queen to e8. And he wants to play bishop to g5, which is a pretty cool idea. You want to perhaps invade on one of this square, perhaps to force exchanges. But there is a funny tactic here for black. He can take on d5, and after e takes d5, the idea is that, well, now this bishop is trapped, and we're going to take it, and it's going to be very unpleasant for black. Actually, the author points to this move. He says bishop a4 is what you should play. But after ba4, for some reason, he goes knight e5. Well, his computer was not as strong as mine is these days. This is a huge advantage, of course, of having to do it later. The computer now says, even if you do knight c5, perhaps things are not too bad, right? It's the usual thing of having this very beautiful knight. I understand we are pawn down, but well, these pawns are not really that valuable. And the question is, can white do something massive, like, let's say, attack like this? But the computer seems to think, no, it's not that harmful. White is still better, but it's very much a game. So, sure, king h1 is perhaps a little bit slow, but it's not like he was winning with other means either. So queen d8 happens, the knight retreats, and after knight c5, he doesn't go for this f5 attack anymore. He actually goes for e5, which is a nice opportunity. He's using this idea that the c5 knight perhaps is a little bit unstable. We see it here after bishop takes g2, king takes g2. From a positional point of view, the logical move would very much be to take on e5. But this just loses a piece after this exchange, and bishop takes c5, right? You just don't want a piece like this. So after e5, it's actually quite unpleasant. The best move would be, well, to sort of admit that this knight is a vulnerability on c5 and go knight a6. Now white can perhaps take on d6, or he can play the move knight to d5 with this threat to b6, and white is better, but not in a tragic sense. Black plays the move rook a6, which looks very, very sensible for me. It's typical that you exploit that you can sort of that this rank is open, and if he takes on d6, you want to take back with the rook. The next move is almost shocking for me, but when you see it, or rather when you understand it, you realize its power. He plays the move bishop takes c5, which is a winning move. Well, the game comes rook takes c5, knight e4, and suddenly we jump to g5. This is humanly possible to understand. After d takes c5, at first sight it looks like isn't, black quite solid. But after the simplistic move rook to d1, black is just strategically busted. We are just gonna take over the d file. I mean, for instance, if you play like this, rook d7 is gonna happen next, and basically it's a disaster. At times we say a bishop is stronger than a knight, but this knight is gonna jump to b5 and stand there forever. It's just hopeless. And well, if you do something like queen c7, we're just gonna more or less do the same. Queen d7, knight b5 is gonna happen next. This position, computer says more than +2. So it's not a small or even a big edge. It's just a completely winning position. And well, black realized that, took with the rook, but then knight e4, that was a check, and queen to d5, and basically it's game over. Well, you are attacking not only on f7, but you attack also on b7, so it wins a pawn, and I think the game was like this. But okay, this is an ending where white has the better position and an extra pawn. That doesn't really matter. So for me, at least, it finishes off, or at least it tries to finish off on a high note. It's basically trying to come up with this model game in this position. But again, it fails a little bit, and that I also like, because it would be a pity if this opening was just so bad for black. But it gives an idea of it's more pleasant to play for white. And I really think that moves like, let's say, calm moves like g3, just improving the position a little bit. Then next, you put the rook on e1, and you start improving the position of your pieces. Maybe it looks passive to you, but you also have to remember that black has spent a lot of energy going back and forth, being ready for this a3, b4 break. So it's actually very clever that white transfers the weight of his potential attack to the king side, and now simply, well, suddenly these rooks on a8 and c8, they had this huge prophylactic value against the queen side attack. But when white keeps the pawns like this and starts attacking on the king side, these rooks actually is somewhat out of play. Well, with this, I will finish this Maroczy chapter. I hope you enjoyed it.